When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth?
Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief.
May our testimonies be as deep and as strong as that of Jacob, who, when confronted by one who sought to destroy his faith, declared, I could not be shaken.
Hello, my friends. Jared Halverson here. Welcome back to Unshaken. Thank you for letting me come and join you once again for Scripture study. I hope that you enjoyed last week, that you were able to come up for air a little bit, and that you're now nice and rested after a light week with only, 2.5 hours, give or take, with Esther. We'll be back on to longer lessons today with the book of Job, but I promise it'll be worth your time because this book is an absolute masterpiece, not just of Scripture, but of world literature. One of my favorite pieces of literature is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. As amazing as the musical was, and as good as the movies have been, none of them can hold a candle to the book. And so you'd think that its author, Victor Hugo, would be a pretty good judge of good literature. Well, this is what he said about the book of Job. The book of Job is perhaps the greatest masterpiece of the human mind. That's tall praise coming from him. And Thomas Carlyle, who was a 19th century Scottish historian and essayist, said, I call this book, apart from all theories about it, and we'll get into some of those today, one of the grandest things ever written. Our first, oldest statement of the never-ending problem, man's destiny and God's ways with him in the earth. There is nothing written, I think, of equal literary merit. Oh, we're in for a treat. And so much of it is the literary aspect of it. It is a combination of poetry and prose. And the poetry far outweighs the prose as far as content. But even beyond the literary, the message that it conveys, the word for the day is theodicy. And theodicy is the technical term for what is sometimes referred to as the problem of evil. And the problem of evil is, why should it exist if God is good and God is all-powerful? You see, that's a question that has kept philosophers and theologians up at night for millennia. That if God is there and he's good and he's all-powerful, then why on earth would he allow horrible things to happen? It suggests that either there's no God, and sadly that's where a lot of people go in our day particularly, and often after they've gone through really hard things, or as they see the devastation and destruction and amount of human suffering in the world, that's their conclusion. There must not be a God. The other options are, well, maybe he's good but not all-powerful. That he's up there as sickened by these things as we are, but just can't do anything about it. That's unfortunate. We've got a nice God, but he's kind of a weakling. The opposite extreme is the other alternative, and that's, well, God is all-powerful. He could do something about this, but he's not good, so he doesn't. Now, I don't like either option. A nice weakling in heaven or an all-powerful meanie. Neither one sounds like a good option. And so that does leave us then with the problem of evil, with theodicy. And this is something that, I remember in divinity school, there was an entire semester course just on theodicy. The book of Job factored into it prominently, believe me. Because I don't know if there's a better book on earth to help us wrestle, and that's what we're going to see today. A lot of wrestling on the part of Job and on his friends, and that's the wrestle that we all need to engage in. I'll also say that I love the book of Job because I'm related to him. He's my father-in-law, and I mean that only a slightly tongue-in-cheek. My father-in-law has been through so many things that he's one of the few people I know personally who'll be able to pull up a chair next to Job in the spirit world and say, oh, well, let me tell you a story or two. He has been through incredible things. His wife passed away when they were, the parents of 7 children, 12 and under, and she died of leukemia. Later he remarried an amazing woman that was willing to become instant mother of 7. And yet, years into that marriage, they lost a child, one of his older sons. And fast forward years later, and he loses his business, he loses his home. Imagine moving from the big house on the top of the hill to the trailer at the bottom of that same hill, to look up and see your past and see what you've lost. He went to prison for something that he didn't do. You don't take on the government even when you know you're innocent. But he did, and the government didn't let him off the hook on that. He had, in more recent years, when he found out that he had cancer, my wife kind of rolled her eyes and said, well, of course he does. What else has he not been through? And just add this to the list. I could go on, and I won't belabor the point, but I'm amazed at his attitude. In some ways, it was even superior to that of Job's. And maybe he has Job to thank for it. Job was our test sample. And for him to endure this kind of suffering and come to the understanding he does by the end, I think that's probably what's gotten my father-in-law through. In fact, as he has said, my Job 2.0, of all the attributes of deity, what amazes him most and what he's most thankful for is divine restraint. I don't know many people who thank the heavens for that attribute. Divine restraint, that God does not bail me out every time I cry out for relief, because he has something higher and holier in mind for me. And that goal, that aim can only be accomplished through trial, through suffering, through opposition in all things. And we are going to see plenty of that today. Now, where does this book fit? What's the history behind it? Those are difficult questions. Maybe that's what Carlyle was getting at with these theories about it. There is so little historically in it that we can't exactly place it. Some scholars suggest that, well, if we're going to place it historically, the best clues that we can muster are that it would fit somewhere in between the flood of Noah and the Tower of Babel. Which is interesting to think of it being squeezed between the story of the ultimate consequences for sin and an incredible amount of human suffering, there's the flood, between that and a story of people doing whatever they can to try to avoid the consequences of sin and suffering. And so have Job right in the middle to teach us something, since he's the one wrestling with these issues. Now others have said, well, maybe there's so little history in it, and it's so difficult to place historically, because maybe it's not historical at all. Perhaps this is a story of a fiction rather than a fact. Now, some people that I know are very opposed to that, and they say, no, how dare you? How dare you fictionalize this story? After all, in section 121 of the Doctrine and Covenants, the Lord says to Joseph Smith, as he's languishing in liberty, thou art not yet as Job. Thy friends haven't turned upon thee. And the yet was probably foreboding. Well, you will be there eventually, soon enough, but you're not there yet. And those that have used that text to justify the reality of Job say things like, well, obviously he was a real human being, a real person, because the Lord calls upon him as evidence to try to reassure Joseph. And yet that same Lord taught in parables all the time. And so he could have said, thou art not yet as the father of the prodigal son, and that still would have meant something to Joseph. Thou art not yet as the man who suffered with no good Samaritan coming yet. That would have meant something to Joseph. We can gain incredible insights from parable as well as actual history. And I don't take a stand on this because we don't have enough evidence one way or the other. Whether this is fact or fiction, the lessons are what matter most, and the lessons are absolutely incredible. Now, part of the challenge is what is this book all about? When I teach it to my institute students, I'll often ask them right before we begin, can anybody sum up the book of Job in 3 very short sentences? I just want to see how concise we can be. And usually they'll raise their hand and say, oh, that's easy. Job had all kinds of stuff. He lost all his stuff, and then he got all his stuff back. Pretty good summary. Now, that's an excellent synopsis, and nice and concise, just like I asked. Now, do you realize, though, that what you just described, as accurate as it is chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 42? Yeah. Job is that long. There are 42 chapters. And those 3 sentences, although they summarize the story, They only cover the first 2 chapters and the very last one, which means we completely skip over the middle 39 when we think about the book of Job. Now, part of me says, I understand why. The middle 39 chapters are the poetry, and the prose is so much more straightforward. That's one of the things that's going to make Isaiah challenging in a couple of weeks, because it's this massive epic poem, basically, with so much imagery and symbolism and figurative language and metaphor and simile and chiasmus and you name it. It's going to make understanding Isaiah difficult. Well, that's what makes understanding the middle portion of Job difficult too. But it's the poetry we have to wrestle with. It is this epic poem on the problem of pain, why it exists, why, especially when it's innocent suffering, why do we have to go through things like this? The problem of evil, Theodicy, if God is good, then why can't life be? And sometimes we're put into situations where that is our question. One last thing to say before we get into the actual story. I remember in Tennessee sitting in church for a High Council Sunday. And the High Counselor that spoke who came across as a little crusty as far as personality was concerned. Once you got past that, he was a wonderful person, but kind of an academic and intellectual and just kind of said it, straight shooter, said it like it was. And I just remember he started his sacrament meeting talk with this. I'd like to discuss with you today the problem of evil. The question of why do bad things happen to good people? And I sat there, okay, perked up, okay, and the Theodicy lesson, fantastic. But what he said next, I doubt I'll ever forget. He said, but that begs another question. Why do bad things happen to good people? Well, let me ask you all this. Who says those are bad things? And who says you're good people? And I just remember dying laughing. He had a total straight face. And I just remember thinking, he totally called us out. Who says we're good people? Now there was actually genius behind his questions. And what we'll see in the book of Job basically are those two questions being fought over and argued about. Who says those are bad things? That's how God's going to respond. And who says you're good people? That's how Job's friends are going to respond to him. And we'll see both of those unfold. In some ways, what I picture as we sit down to hear from this incredible man of God is if Lehi were to raise his hand in a gospel doctrine class, as we've gathered our cloud of scriptural witnesses, Lehi would say, as he said so many times in the Book of Mormon, if you'll keep the commandments, you'll prosper in the land. It's as simple as that. Throughout the book of Deuteronomy, you see the exact same message. Keep the commandments, you'll prosper in the land. Alma gives us the reverse, but it's the same thing. Wickedness never was happiness. Moses, I have set before thee life and death. So choose life, and you choose life by choosing to obey. It's as simple as that. If you'll do what God says, he will bless you. Now that's true sometimes, because I could picture Lehi saying that emphatically. And I picture Job hesitantly raising his hand on the other side of the classroom and saying forlornly, yeah, that wasn't exactly my experience. And so if the Lehi version, the simplistic approach that obedience always brings immediate blessings, if that's too simplistic to be absolutely true, then I hope that we are prepared for a higher order lesson from Job today. Lehi was teaching us Mortality 101. Job has paid the price to matriculate in Mortality 505. This is upper division. And I pray that especially you who are going through difficult things, you for whom the problem of pain is not abstract, but incredibly concrete and immediate and personal and painful, then I pray that our discussion today will be a blessing to you, as it's been to me. The story begins in Job chapter 1, verse 1, go figure, where we get to meet our main character. There was a man in the land of Uz, and that's the challenge. We don't know exactly where that is. Some suggest that it's off in the eastern side of Mesopotamia, near where Babylon and Persia were headquartered. Others suggest that it's southeast Israel, where the Edomites eventually lived. Again, it doesn't matter. Part of the beauty of this book is that it is so widely applicable. If you've ever suffered, then this book speaks to you, okay? So wherever this land was, call it your land because you've lived there or someday will. His name was Job, and that man was perfect and upright and one that feared God and eschewed evil. Now that's our very first introduction, and if that's all you know about Job, on the one hand, you're probably leaning, it's probably fictional then, because I'd have never met anybody quite like that. Perfect and upright? Well, they strive to be. Now, perfect in this case, we don't have to necessarily assume that that means sinlessness. When Jesus said, "Be ye therefore perfect," at the end of Matthew chapter 5, there's some great etymology behind that Greek term, that's your finished product, you're whole, you're complete. But that doesn't mean that you were flawless on the way to get there. But according to this verse, it does suggest that Job has arrived at that state of wholeness and completeness. He's an upright man. So here's a man of integrity, of honesty, of righteousness and worthiness. He fears God, so he reverences God. He honors God in all that he does. And he eschews evil. As soon as evil pokes out its ugly head, Job is turning away and running. We'll see evidence of that as we go on. But please think, if this is our earliest introduction to this man, what can we assume his life will look like? Verse 1 is his character. Well, verse 2 is going to introduce us to his existence. How is he living? Amazingly. So what's his life going to look like? Well, it's going to be pretty amazing too. If you have the understanding that Lehi and Moses and most of Scripture gives us, that elementary level, obedience always brings blessings. Well, sure enough, verse 2 and 3, there were born unto him 7 sons and 3 daughters. Numerous seed. And if you think about, again, Old Testament, Abrahamic covenant, and so forth, the promise of posterity is the greatest blessing you could ask for. And he had incredible blessings here too. I actually had to point out to my father-in-law, we were laughing once about the book of Job and his parallel to it. Laughing because it's better than crying, though he deserves to. And I pointed out the fact that, Dad, it's eerie how similar you are to him, down to the point that you have 10 kids, just like Job. And my father was like, whoa, I'd forgotten that detail. Really? He had 10 kids? I was like, yeah, it gets better. Your 10 are 7 sons and 3 daughters. And guess how Job's family makeup was? Exactly identical. It's eerie how parallel this is. But now that we have the family numbers in place, keep reading in verse 3, his substance also was 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 she-asses, and a very great household. That's all of his servants. So that this man was the greatest of all the men of the East. Again, if you are under the ideology that wickedness never was happiness and righteousness always brings it in the immediate, in the short term, then verse 2 and 3 are exactly what you would expect based on verse 1. Righteousness equals prosperity. And temporal blessings always reflect spiritual blessings. By the way, most of the book of Job will problematize that oversimplified notion. It will call into question, is that always the case? And it's important that gets called into question. There are things out there today called, false beliefs called the prosperity gospel. And the problem with the prosperity gospel is not that it's all false, but that it's kind of based on half-truths. Thinking that if we keep the commandments, of course God will prosper us. Because sometimes we get those reversed. If I want to look worthy, then I should look wealthy. And sometimes we live beyond our means because we want to appear to be blessed. We want people to assume that we are righteous, and that's why we're rich. Or that we are pure, and that's why we're prospering. Some of the most worthy and righteous people I've ever met have been poor. But not poor in spirit. simply poor in the things of the world, and they have turned to God as a result and become so much like him. So be aware and beware of the shallowness of thinking that those are always synonymous in the immediate aftermath of righteousness, if I can say it that way. Well, keep reading. Job's children in chapter 1 are out feasting together. A nice close-knit family. That would be a blessing to Job as well. But in verse 5, it was so, when the days of their feasting were gone about, that Job sent and sanctified them, and rose up early in the morning and offered burnt offerings according to the number of them all. For Job said, it may be, I don't know for sure, but just maybe, just perhaps, my sons have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. And thus did Job continually. I don't know if I've seen examples of just-in-case repentance just like this one, especially meant for other people. I mean, it's one thing for Job to be a quote-unquote perfect and upright man himself, but just in case my children aren't quite as worthy as I am, I should probably sanctify them. I should keep working on that. I should offer burnt offerings and sacrifices for their behalf. In hopes that God will forgive them for whatever they do, even if it's only in their hearts that they're cursing God. I don't know why they'd curse him. They've got an incredible life. I mean, they're related to me after all, and here I am, the greatest of all the men of the East, and so they've got nothing to complain about. Life is good for them. Prosperity gospel, you better believe it. But just in case that anything goes wrong within, I'll try to cover their bases as best I can. In verse 6, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan came also among them. And the Lord said unto Satan, whence comest thou? Then Satan answered the Lord and said, from going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. Now a hugely important character has just walked onto the stage, and that's Satan. Surprisingly, we haven't seen many personal appearances of the adversary so far in the Old Testament. I mean, he played some starring roles back at the beginning, right, in the fall. Moses chapter 1 as well. But since then, he's been content to remain behind the scenes, trying to bring Israel down and largely succeeding at it. But here, he's front and center as he comes waltzing up to God, and God engages him in conversation. Some have wondered, is this literal? Or is this figurative in some way as well? And we could say we don't really know. Now, on the figurative side, you could say, yes, Satan, in fact, the name is more title than proper name. Satan simply means the adversary, ha-satan, in Hebrew. And so here it comes the adversary. And we might even reshuffle that word and call it, here comes the adversity. If Satan then becomes the embodiment of evil, in terms of the problem of evil, if Satan becomes the personification of pain and problem, he is the source of so much of it, right? And so to think of Satan, problems personified, going to and fro about the earth and leaving suffering in his wake, then the figurative approach to that verse is pretty accurate. Then again, the literal approach is pretty accurate as well. Now, I'm not sure about this thought of God was gathering the sons of God, and all of a sudden Satan shows up to discuss the prospects of being able to tempt Job. That I'm not so sure about that. But based on what he's about to say in his conversation with God, I love the literal side of this because it suggests what happened in premortality, as far as the war in heaven is concerned. Notice in the next couple of verses, as the conversation unfolds, think of it in terms of the war in heaven. Verse 8, the Lord said unto Satan, hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? So God gives Satan the same introduction to Job that we got back in verse 1. The fact that there are none like him suggests a one-of-a-kind nature that would do anything for God and would never associate with evil. This man is perfect and upright. Now, if we're thinking war in heaven, who's the only one that fits that description? Well, Job becomes an incredible type and shadow of Jesus Christ. For the Father to point to the Son when he asked, whom shall I send? It would have to be someone that fits that kind of description. for him to be able to overcome the opposition that the adversary was bringing up. But notice what happens next. Verse 9, Satan answered the Lord and said, Fine, doth Job fear God for naught? Hast not thou made an hedge about him and about his house and about all that he hath on every side? Thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his substance is increased in the land. But put forth thine hand now, and touch all that he hath. He will curse thee to thy face. It's amazing how close that is to some of the arguments that Satan must have presented in premortality. Think about what he said. The only reason he's righteous is because there's this hedge about him. The only way that people can live good lives is if life is good. Nice and easy for them. Now think about what he was presenting. A plan where life would be easy. A plan where there would be a hedge around you to protect you from the consequences of your own choice. That's the loss of agency. Too often we think of Satan's plan meaning of no agency, meaning there's no choice. Well, the other inherent part of agency is not just choice, but consequence. And he could give you choice and eliminate consequence, and there goes agency. And there goes any problems that would keep you from returning to God. It's an amazing solution. I mean, logically it doesn't work. There has to be cause and effect. There has to be connections here. There will be consequence to sin. That's the law of the harvest. That's just how it works. But in terms of what Satan was going for and the human fears that he was trying to leverage, I will give you the hedge. I will make it so that you all return home to be with God. Granted, you won't be like God, but let's not talk about that, okay? Because to become like him, we're going to have to tear down the hedge. This is starting to get closer and closer to the main message of the book of Job. But there in premortality, for the adversary to say, I will make things easier for you. And that way you will honor me. I will get the glory. The only reason that Job honors you, God, is because you keep honoring him with all of these undeserved blessings. Oh, but take them away, and he'll curse you to hit your face. Oh, think hard and try to draw parallels between this little scene in Job chapter 1 and the war in heaven, and it's incredible just how true to life this Satan is. Now in verse 12, the Lord responds. The same God who trusted the Son, that someone as perfect and upright as Jehovah would be able to lead the way and set the example so that we could all navigate our mortal life. This same God who trusted us without the hedge and allowed us to recognize and face the consequences of our poor decision, and then sent his Son to be able to atone for it. This same God of the plan says to Satan in verse 12, Fine. Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thine hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord, giddy as a schoolboy, I'm sure, with the green light to cause Job to suffer. At least suffer indirectly. I'm going to remove from him all of his temporal blessings. Now again, did God literally say that to Satan in Job chapter 1? I don't know. But did he basically allow for that in premortality? You better believe it. I'm going to allow opposition to exist on the earth. That will be the gravity that allows people to actually build muscles when they start lifting the weight. Without that opposition, you can move all kinds of weight, but it won't be weighty, and you won't grow from the experience. So yes, there will be opposition in all things, and it's amazing how much of that is provided by the adversary. It is nice to know, however, based on that text, that whatever leeway that Lucifer has, God, it is still circumscribed by the power of God. That God can say to the adversary, thus far and no further. And I'm grateful to know that. And in some ways, I'm not surprised that God gave Lucifer that green light, Because, again, part of that opposition in all things, but also it helps to prove us as far as what are the motivations behind our actions. Do we have ulterior motives? And is it just because that I'm behind a hedge, that I'm feeling safe and protected? Is it only because I'm being blessed? I mean, again, that goes back to that shallow sense of obedience brings immediate blessings. And that is kind of a stage one view of the world. We try to raise our children with that. I mean, we train our pets that way, right? Pavlov's dog, as soon as you do it, I'll give you the treat. Well, that's good as far as command and response. But what about things that require more long-term perseverance? Like I said, this is good stage one child rearing, stage one faith in God, stage one understanding of what mortality looks like. But we tend not to remain in stage one permanently. And so what are we going to do next? This test that Lucifer is going to assist with is actually the test that we all need to learn to pass. Because Job, first verse we met him, seems to have already arrived. But as we will see in upcoming chapters, the long epic poem about the problem of pain, we're going to see that he still has some growing up to do. He needs to progress out of stage one, which he has totally mastered, through the difficulty of stage two, onto the glories of stage three. We've talked about this before. Creation, fall, atonement. That's the story arc of life. That's the story arc of Job too. He has mastered creation stage, where all was wonderful. The Garden of Eden was surrounded by the hedge, so to speak, and there were no consequences of sin. Here comes the adversary into the Garden of Eden to push them out. So not only is this an embodiment or a parallel to the war in heaven, but it's a parallel to the creation and the fall in Eden as well. So here comes the serpent slithering into the garden. Here comes Satan up before the son and daughter of God, Adam and Eve. And can we test them? Can we push them out and see if they'll still be faithful? What we'll see through the 39 chapters in the middle is Job through the fall and wrestling to come to terms with the elevation of the atonement that will lift him higher and holier than he ever was back in chapter 1. It's just going to take some wrestling to get there. In some ways, this is also one of the points of the Sermon on the Mount. How does chapter 5 of Matthew 5, 6, 7, there's the sermon. How does chapter 5 end? Be ye therefore perfect and upright and fear God and eschew evil. Be ye therefore as Job, God could say. And yet the sermon isn't done. If you've reached perfection, you'd think that God is like, okay, you're good. You made it. You are perfect. But no, chapter 6 follows. And what's chapter 6 of the sermon all about? Purifying our motives. Now that you're perfect, can you perfect the reasons that you've sought perfection? And then chapter 7, even after you've finished chapter 6 and you're living perfectly with perfect motives, there's still chapter 7, which is all about judgment, because some people are still back in chapter 5 or chapter 6. Cut them some slack. Don't judge them. And we'll see that problem personified with Job's 3 friends a little bit later. Anyway, there are so many threads woven together in this incredible tapestry. And right here from the start, we're only a handful of verses in, we are seeing the plan of salvation unfold before us. And how will we do once we are totally tested? Now, for the rest of this chapter, Job's physical body remains behind the hedge. But everything outside of him is fair game, and the adversary wreaks havoc on it. In verse 14 and 15, there came a messenger unto Job, and said, the oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them, and the Sabaeans fell upon them, and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Now this is only the first wave of adversity that's about to come crashing down on Job's head. And it's a peripheral one. If you picture Job as the target, the bullseye of the target, and then these concentric circles around it, Satan is beginning to pick off the periphery. And what he starts with are these oxen and asses. It's Job's beasts of burden. He can get by without those, right? Well, if these are the ones that are doing the plowing to be able to grow crops, to be able to feed his family, this is harder than we might think. If you've ever lost a job, for example, that might be the modern equivalent. I can't provide for my family. What am I supposed to do? And there's often a loss of self-confidence that comes with that. There is a feeling of vulnerability and exposure to a world that no longer seems as secure as it once did. This is a hard moment for Job. And only one servant that comes in out of breath telling this sad tale. Like I said, this is only going to be the first of many, and the waves come crashing in such quick succession that as soon as one servant is finished telling his tale of woe, the next one rushes in out of breath with something even worse to say. This first one, I don't know how we're going to plant crops. I don't know how we're going to grow anything. But notice this also, whose fault is it? Well, it was those Sabaeans who came in, some enemy tribe that came rushing in and took the animals or destroyed them, which gives Job someone to point to and blame. That's going to be important when you compare it to the next wave of adversity. Verse 16, while he was yet speaking, so there's no time to recover, one more wave of adversity come crashing down, there came also another and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven and hath burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. So again, I'm the only survivor. We will see that repeated each time. Now, no sheep. This is different than the first affliction. The first was beasts of burden. Well, my sheep aren't going to plow. True. But they can feed. That's what you could have used to feed your family. If there's not going to be any agricultural growth, at least we have flocks and herds to feed upon. Well, not anymore. There goes a major food supply in the ancient Near East. And not only that, but I mentioned being exposed to a world that now seems to be opposed to you. Well, I can't even use the sheep's wool as clothing to cover myself from that. I am literally being stripped naked and exposed to a world that no longer has my best interests at heart. Up to this point, it seems like, oh yeah, I figured it out. I live a good life, and life then is good. But something's gone wrong in the meantime, and I am now uncovered. Remember that word, the coat of skins, covering nakedness, atonement, all of that. Without sheep, how will I cover myself? And then the other detail, how did this one happen? The fire of God is fallen from heaven. That's why I pointed out in the first wave of adversity, it was human agency being used against Job. And often, in the history of trying to explain theodicy, that's usually where people tend to run first, chalking up the problem of evil not to God, but to other people. In other words, we suffer not because God is bad or not powerful, but because people have the power within them to do bad things. And we suffer as a result. Now that is true. And so many of the sources of human suffering are man-made. And that's tragic. It says something about us in our fallen nature. But in this second instance, no. That's no longer an option. And honestly, as people wrestle with the problem of evil, once they see past the human agency part, they then turn to divine agency. And they start thinking about natural disasters and earthquakes and fires and floods and famines and things where there's no human hand to blame. That God is behind this. I mean, one of the most angry skeptics of the 18th century was Voltaire. And what was it that pushed him over the edge into skepticism? It was the earthquake in Lisbon, Portugal, and the incredible loss of life that occurred as a result. You could chalk up Voltaire's loss of faith to theodicy. And it was the round 2 that Job suffered, not the round 1. God is to blame here. And God could have avoided that without interfering with anyone's agency. He didn't have to let that natural disaster happen. Well, Job now has more to wrestle with. Do I blame the Sabaeans? Well, now who do I blame? The fire of God falling from heaven? I don't want to look in that direction for an enemy. Keep reading. In verse 17, while he was yet speaking. You see what a beautiful literary masterpiece this is? We see these repeated phrases that come up with each round of affliction. While he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Now at least we're back to human agency. We seem to be we're going to be bouncing back and forth between the two to try to wrestle with the whole issue here. But we have Chaldeans to blame, and what have they taken? The camels. Now, that's a different trial than the oxen and asses. It's a different trial from the sheep. In some ways, I wonder, Job, what are you going to do? How are you going to provide for yourself and your family when you can't plant crops and grow food? You can't eat your flocks and herds. Oh, well, if you're one of the mightiest men of the East, I'm sure you have many a trade partner. And with your camels, you can go out and trade the increase of your fields and flocks. You can get whatever you need from a distance that you don't happen to grow right here at home. But now, without camels, how are you going to, you can't get up and move and find greener pastures somewhere, nor can you trade for those that live in the greener pastures, and you can borrow or buy some of their things. This is like losing your job, and then losing your home, and losing your car, and wondering, where do I go from here? Well, in Job's case, unfortunately, you keep going downhill. Verse 18, while he was yet speaking, there came also another. By this point, I'm picturing Job dreading the thought of any more servants showing up with bad news. Well, this was the worst news of all. This servant says, thy sons and thy daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. Again, a close-knit bunch, a wonderful family. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness, and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead. And I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Alone, only. Those words would have haunted Job this time more than any of the previous iterations, because he's feeling alone. He still has his wife. We'll meet her in a moment. But my children are gone? All of them? All 10? And the servant probably can't even bring himself to say it again. Yes, your children are gone. I can't imagine a more devastating trial than this one. Satan has been recalibrating his aim. He's getting closer and closer to the target. It's not just the oxen. It's not just the sheep. It's not just the camels. It's your own kids. And they're gone. It's not just that you can't provide for your family. It's not that you just can't feed your family. It's that you have no more family to feed. And worst of all, you have no one to blame for this but God. No direction to shake your fist except heavenward. Because it wasn't the Chaldeans this time, it wasn't the Sabaeans this time, it was a great wind from the wilderness, and only God makes the wind blow. How could he? How could he do this to me? How could he do this to my children? They were innocent. I made sure of it. I sanctified them. I offered sacrifice just in case. But all of that for naught? Now, there's actually one more wrinkle to this concern that haunts me personally. Because what's interesting is they weren't killed by the wind per se. They weren't swept away in a whirlwind. We see that in 3rd Nephi, but not in Job 1. There was something in the middle that took place, and it was the fact they were under the roof of this oldest son, and the wind blew out the corners of the house, and the house is what crushed them. Now, I said there's no one to blame here but God. But I wonder, how do homes get built? Yes, it belonged to the oldest son, but this was a tight-knit family. I'm assuming they all chipped in and helped. I assume Job had more experience in home construction than his son did, having probably built his own, and to be the general contractor, when a home comes crashing down, how do you not second guess yourself? How do you live with regret for the rest of your life as you wonder, could I have done anything different? Could I have built it better? Could I have made it stronger? Is this on me? No, I didn't cause the wind to blow, but is there anything more I could have done? That's the haunting lament of the Lord of the Vineyard, right? Or in the allegory of the olive tree, Jacob 5. What more could I have done for my vineyard? And sadly, for us, there's always an answer. I could have done more. I could have tried harder. What more could I have done to help my children so they didn't fall away? I know so many parents that are haunted by that question. Because of course we can always do better. That's always the case. But to spend the rest of our lives beating ourselves up over those kinds of regrets, I've said before, I'm a fixer by nature, which unfortunately makes me a blamer by nature of the natural man. I want to fix it, so I want to see what the problem was and who caused it. And when I'm the one who caused it, it's pretty devastating. And it takes a lot of effort to try to come to terms with my own weakness and mistakes, and it could have been different if I had been different. And I wonder if this is one more aspect of what Job has to go through in order to personify the human experience. If Satan is our personification of the problem of pain and suffering and evil and opposition, then Job is the suffering servant. Job is us. But I'll also say Job is Jesus. He who condescended below all things. He who had to wrap himself around the entirety of the human experience, even down to the point of these kinds of personal regrets and dwelling on past failings and could things have been different if I had been. Well, how do you end this chapter of suffering and woe? In verse 20, Job arose. He rent his mantle, he shaved his head, he fell down upon the ground, and fill in the blank. I'll often ask my students to do exactly that. What's the verb? He rent his mantle, shaved his head. It fell on the ground. He's obviously mourning. So what would be your final verb? He wept. He mourned. He lamented. He grieved. He cried. He cursed. He blamed. He complained. They're all, any number of verbs would fit there perfectly, which makes the one that actually appears all the more astonishing. Job arose and rent his mantle and shaved his head and fell down upon the ground and worshipped. That to me is one of the most powerful verbs you'll ever see in the grammar of God. To go through something like that and to fall down in worship, of honoring God, of praising Him, that I ever had time to spend with those beautiful children at all. That you had blessed me so abundantly, and I saw your hand in the blessing, and I see your hand in the taking away of that blessing. But at least I see the hand, and I worship it. I don't know if I see a more submissive example of worship anywhere in Scripture than right here. After which he says in verse 21, naked came I out of my mother's womb, and naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. You want to talk about complete faith in God. Naked came I in, naked will I leave. And anything that happened in the meantime, in between those two events, that was just a bonus. That was a blessing. But one that wasn't intended to last in this life. Remember, naked, uncovered, unatoned for. Oh, I'm grateful that doesn't apply to us. Our sins can be covered by the atonement of Christ. But yes, we are exposed not only to the demands of justice, which didn't seem to be the challenge for Job since he was perfect and upright, but exposed to the vicissitudes of life, exposed to the challenges of mortality. And what did we expect? That's what God promised us in premortality. It was only the adversary assuring us of some kind of hedge to keep us safely behind. Well, round 1 and chapter 1 goes to Job. Job 1, adversary 0. And Job proved God right. Have you not considered my servant Job? He's as good as they come, and you failed in your misconception of him. Well, the adversary is not one to give up easily. And so, of course, he thinks, well, it's because you wouldn't let me get to the bullseye. Yes, you made the hedge a little closer to Job, but it's still there. So how about round 2? Verse 1 of chapter 2, again, there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. And Satan came also among them to present himself before the Lord. And the Lord said unto Satan, From whence comest thou? And Satan answered the Lord and said, From going to and fro in the earth, and from walking up and down in it. Same as before. Life goes on, all of its ups, all of its downs. That's just how it works. But verse 3, the Lord says to Satan, Hast thou considered my servant Job, that there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and an upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil? Literarily, there is redundance for a reason here. Life has gone on, and Job's righteousness has gone on, despite all that has happened in the meantime. It's amazing that he hasn't changed as a result of his sufferings. God says that. Still he holdeth fast his integrity, although thou movest me against him to destroy him without cause. You tried your best. You did your worst, and Job still came out shining. Now notice the end of that phrase. You tried to destroy him without cause. And I wonder if that's one more level of adversity beyond what we saw in chapter 1. That admission, he didn't deserve that. And I think one of the things that makes suffering worst is when it's innocent suffering. It's one thing when we kind of know, yeah, I deserve that. I had that coming. But when it comes out of the blue and you can't blame yourself at all. As hard as it is to blame yourself, the opposite is also true. It's really hard when you know that you're not to blame. Then why is this happening to me? Elder Maxwell once talked about adversity, and he talked about irony as the hard crust on the bread of adversity. I mean, adversity is pretty tough fare anyway. It's not exactly Wonder Bread. You wonder why the bread is as tough as it is. And add to that a crust on the outside that makes it even harder to eat. This is impossible to swallow. And it's the irony that makes adversity all the worse. To suffer without cause, this is something that Job is going to have to keep wrestling with. In verse 4, Satan answered the Lord and said, Well, fine, skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath will he give for his life. As long as you survive your trials, and it wasn't the worst case scenario after all. So let's intensify it, shall we? Put forth thine hand now, and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee to thy face. You see, so far it's all been one step removed from direct, immediate suffering. But once you get rid of that innermost hedge and allow people to suffer in ways that there's no avoiding, though then he'll curse you to your face. Up to this point, I'm sure Job could, as hard as it might be, he could still mentally check out. He could somehow try to push back the negative emotions of things and just steel himself against the suffering that remained outside of him. But have him suffer it himself? Oh, physical agony leaves no escape. So let's try that. In verse 6, the Lord said unto Satan, fine, behold, he is in thine hand, but save his life. Again, I'll give you some leeway, but your power is limited. But in Job's case, it will be barely limited. You can push him to the very brink of death. Again, if you think of Jesus as, Job as our type and shadow of Jesus, think about what King Benjamin said about him, that he would suffer physical agony, right? He would suffer hunger, thirst, fatigue, pain, even more than man can suffer, except it be unto death. That Christ's agonies would be such that it was just a hair's breadth removed from death. And in essence, God gave Satan permission to push Job just that far. And so it goes. Verse 8. So went Satan forth from the presence of the Lord, and smote Job with sore boils from the sole of his foot unto his crown. He took him a potsherd to scrape himself withal, and he sat down among the ashes. Boils, and I don't know all that entails. But from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head, there is no body part that seems unaffected by this. To the point that he just takes a broken piece of pottery, which seems to represent him as well. Talk about a metaphor. And he takes that brokenness and uses it to try to alleviate some of his own pain. Just scratching himself, trying to eliminate some of his agony. These objects seem so appropriate for Job. I'm just a potsherd. God has broken me. I'm sitting in the ashes. He has burned down my hopes, and I've got nothing left. His wife then speaks to him in verse 9, and this is the first time we meet her. She says, dost thou still retain thine integrity? Curse God and die. Now we need to pause here and consider this woman. We don't know her name. We know nothing about her. Well, next to nothing. She appears in this verse really alone. And yet when I teach women in the scriptures classes, we try to spend some extra time with Job's wife. Because if you are married to suffering personified, if you're sealed to the embodiment of anguish, then yes, your life's going to be hard too. If it's one thing for a father to lose these 10 children, but for a mother's heart to break, to shatter, imagine what she's going through. The fact that she didn't die in all of the death that we saw in chapter 1, at least it would have been the end of her suffering. I suppose that Satan could have used that as one more way to get at Job. But I wonder if this was an even harder one. Because though she didn't die physically, this verse suggests some level of spiritual death. Because she's the one suggesting to her husband, curse God and die. There's nothing left for us. Why keep trying? Worship is not the verb I would have put at the end of that verse. We have nothing. We've been reduced to absolute nothingness, and God's behind this. So curse God and die. Now, like I said, it would have been a brutally difficult trial for Job to lose his wife physically, but here, does it seem that he's losing her spiritually? And that, to me, might be an even worse trial. Some of you, I know, are going through that. Actually, it was my mother-in-law that helped me see this trial in this verse, because she went through something similar and has allowed me to share parts of her story. She has been so open with it herself. I'm amazed by my parents-in-law and Job and Mrs. Job. They've been through so many things together, including the loss of faith on my mother-in-law's part. mostly because of what she went through being married to Job all those years. Wondering, how could God do this to him, to our children, to our family, to me? Because every trial that he went through, she went through right alongside him. Until it left her cursing God and wanting to die herself. And both of those instances were very literal for her. I'm grateful that the book of Job has a happy ending, and grateful that the story for my parents-in-law is beautifully happy right now too. With my mother-in-law having fully returned to the church, rebaptized after having had her name removed from the records. Oh, a woman of incredible faith and incredible fortitude, despite everything that she's been through. I believe that the same was true of Job's wife. But this moment, she reached her breaking point. And who can blame her? I don't get a sense that Job ever does. But the fact that he has to see her go through this, and that she doesn't hold to the faith that's going to see him through it, that has to be a brutally difficult trial for him as well. And yet he perseveres. He says to her in verse 10, "Thou speakest as one of the foolish women speaketh. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil?" In other words, we have to trust him no matter what he sends our way. Naked were we both when we came into the world. Naked will we both be when we leave. In all this, the verse ends, did not Job sin with his lips? Well, not with his lips, but I do wonder, what about your heart, Job? That's the part I can't quite see. You were the one that was concerned and repented just in case, or offered sacrifice for sin just in case your children sinned in their hearts. What's happening in yours? Well, we're going to see a lot of the heart wrestle in the next few chapters, but something has to happen before we get there. And the way chapter 2 ends, you see, this would have been a perfect ending. It would have gone a perfect parallel with chapter 1. And we've seen so many parallels between chapter 2 and chapter 1, literarily, that ending right there with Job's statement of faith, that's exactly how chapter 1 ended. And yet, to complicate matters and to thicken the plot, chapter 2 ends with the coming of his friends. They're the ones that are going to be behind this long epic poem, this discussion of Theodicy. And so we need to meet them here. In verse 11, when Job's 3 friends, and yes, that's what they were, when they heard of all this evil that was come upon him, they came every one from his own place. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, Zophar the Naamathite, for they had made an appointment together to come to mourn with him and to comfort him. Now, just like our first impression of Job was incredibly positive, our first impression of these 3 men should be positive as well. They are introduced as friends. And they seem to be exactly that. They've made an appointment together. Let's do strength in numbers. Job's going to need all the support he can get. So let's come together and mourn with him and comfort him. And let's do it in that order. If you remember the baptismal promise, the covenant in Mosiah 18, we promise, among other things, to mourn with those that mourn and comfort those that stand in need of comfort. And the order there is key. I'm usually guilty of can we get past the mourning as quickly as possible? I just don't like the downer. Let's get on and let's fix it. Okay, so let's comfort those that stand in need of comfort. And yet without the empathy and the understanding at first, then my solutions tend to fall short. These 3 friends are better than I am at that. But there's also a problem in what they said when they heard of this evil that was come upon him. Now, forgive me if I'm reading too much into this, but evil, because they're going to go there mentally pretty quick. And I can't blame them, because that is their culture. That is their worldview. And the idea, like we saw before, if you keep the commandments, you prosper in the land. Well, if you're not prospering in the land, it must be because you haven't been keeping the commandments. Sin equals suffering. Sin will always bring suffering. Therefore, reverse it. Anytime you see suffering, it must be the result of sin. And what do they call this? This is evil that has come upon Job. And since God isn't evil, then it must be Job's evil that's behind all of this. Now, they're not saying any of that, not yet anyway, but they'll get there far too quickly. Verse 12, when they lifted up their eyes afar off, they knew him not. That's how unrecognizable Job was in his agony. They lifted up their voice and wept, mingling their tears with his own. They rent everyone his mantle, just like he had done. They sprinkled dust upon their heads toward heaven. This is true empathy. This is true calm passion, calm with passion, suffering, feeling. And they're willing to sit with him in the dirt, among the ashes, perhaps taking a turn at the potsherd, trying to offer Job whatever empathy they can. In verse 13, so they sat down with him upon the ground 7 days, 7 nights, and none spake a word unto him, for they saw that his grief was very great. I worry that all too often we don't go and sit with people because we don't know what to say. We don't get around to comforting them because we don't know how to mourn with them. And words just fall short. What am I supposed to say? I love the end of chapter 2 because these friends, and friends they were indeed, they knew they didn't need to say anything. None of that would have helped or changed anything anyway. And so often when people are suffering, it's not our words that they need, it's simply our company. A shoulder to cry on, not a mouth to lecture them with. And the fact they did it for 7 days and 7 nights, such a great symbol of totality, of completeness, perhaps hoping that by then Job will be all cried out. Well, chapter 3, this is where the poem begins. And this is where the real drama, the real wrestling begins to unfold. Verse 1, after this opened Job his mouth and cursed. But what did he curse? He cursed his day, not his God. Huge difference. I'm cursing my circumstance. I'm cursing, just lamenting, weeping, mourning over what I'm going through. But I am not shaking my fist heavenward. It's okay to recognize we're having a bad day. It's okay to mourn that life is so difficult, but he's not cursing God here. Instead, he spake and said, let the day perish wherein I was born, and the night in which it was said, there is a man-child conceived. He continues that same lamentation for several more verses, and each one is one more instance of cursing his life and cursing the day he was born. I wish it had never come. Life itself has become too much to bear. In verse 11, why died I not from the womb? Why did I not give up the ghost when I came out of the belly? If I had died before all of this adversity, I could have been buried like the kings with all of my glory behind me. I could have been stillborn and never had to face the difficulties of life to begin with. Throughout this entire chapter, he envies the dead. He longs for the grave. In verse 17, he says, there the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary be at rest. There the prisoners rest together. They hear not the voice of the oppressor. By then the test will be over. No wicked Sabaeans or Chaldeans. No more tears. The book of Revelation promises that God will wipe all of those away. But here in this veil of sorrows, this time of tears, I'm suffering it all. And why can't it come to an end? I don't know if you've ever had an experience or been pushed to the point where the 4th verse of Come, Come, Ye Saints actually makes sense. Where you could actually feel with those pioneers the sentiment behind the statement, and should we die before our journey's through, happy day, all is well. How on earth could their own premature death be happy? The next line, we then are free from toil and sorrow too. With the just we shall dwell. If you've never felt that, congratulations that life has been fairly pleasant. without the kinds of difficulties that make death look like a welcome relief. And I'm not talking suicide here. That is a different thing. That's mental illness by and large. Because if there's one thing that lies at the core of all living beings, it's the desire to hold on to life at all costs. I'm convinced that thoughts of suicide are signs that something is not quite right mentally. And those that suffer in that way deserve all of our compassion and empathy and help, support, hospitalization, whatever it takes. Actually, read the next few verses and we'll see where Job is on this. Verse 20, he says, "Wherefore is light given to him that is in misery, and life unto the bitter in soul, which long for death, but it cometh not, and dig for it more than for hid treasures, which rejoice exceedingly, and are glad when they can find the grave." This is an incredibly difficult passage to navigate, because it seems that Job is as close to suicidal ideation as anyone I think you'll ever see in Scripture. We saw suicide already with Saul, for example. But here Job, this perfect man, upright, eschewing evil, eschews that evil. Or he could have committed suicide. He refuses to, and that says to me, again, something about the force of his character. If this is what I must suffer, then so be it. I just wish it wasn't. I wish that it could end. But I'm not going to take matters into my own hands. And if you are suffering and struggling with suicidal thoughts, then please seek professional help. Seek the companionship of friends immediately. Get your 3 friends to come and mourn with you and comfort you, or just sit with you, even if it's 7 days of silence. I'm grateful that the world is taking this so much more seriously, and that there is a 988 that hopefully will become as easily memorized as a 911, with a suicide hotline that people can call to get whatever kind of help and relief that they need. No, Job is not suicidal here, but he's at an interesting place. And if you've never been there, then again, congratulations on a life that hasn't yet been hard enough for you to commiserate with Job here. And come with miserate. Misery is probably the appropriate term. There's an interesting contrary to prove between loving life and seeing its end as a welcome relief. I know that often happens to the old and to those who are in a state of suffering. My saintly grandma was at that point in her late 90s and just had lived a full life and joyful and optimistic throughout it all, despite her own trials. But by the end, she was ready to move on, and was never suicidal. That wasn't it, but it was a thought of, I have loved the journey, and I can't wait to arrive at my destination. It's been an incredible experience, but what a relief when I'm done. Passing on, or passing the test. Oh, that's a commencement ceremony with good times ahead on the other side of the veil. And Job just wants to get there. Happy day, all is well, because toil and sorrow are behind me. In verse 25, he says, "For the thing which I greatly feared is come upon me, and that which I was afraid of is come unto me. I was not in safety, neither had I rest, neither was I quiet, yet trouble came." The ending of chapter 3 there lets us know we need to add another entry to our list of lamentations. The things that Job has gone through. And according to this one, it's the thing I greatly feared. I mean, he's shifted pretty abruptly from this longing for death, this cursing his own existence. I would have preferred to have been stillborn. But then to go to this last fear of, I don't fear death, I welcome it. What I feared was suffering so intensely. What I feared was loss, because that's what I've gone through. The way he says it, I was not in safety, neither had I rest, neither was I quiet. Which lets you know that even during his days of blessedness, he struggled with a concern over it being taken away. That's, I think, a detail about Job that goes unrecognized. But that admission there at the end of chapter 3 is fascinating. This dread of sorrow that got in the way of his times of happiness. That this fear over loss interfering with how much he could enjoy the gain. For those who suffer with mental illness, I think even worse than anxiety is being anxious about being anxious. And even worse than depression is being depressed about your depression. It's like one step beyond and intensifies it, because even when things are going well and you're not suffering from your anxiety, when you start to get anxious that I'm going to have another panic attack, then the bad times have ruined the good. And even when you're not feeling as depressed as usual, your depression over the possibility of depression starts to factor in. And it ruins things. Job suffered with that even during his good times. So how do you navigate that? In fact, how do you make sense of that, especially when your worldview is sin and suffering are synonymous? We will see that unfold in the next 30 chapters or so. Because by the time you start with chapter 4, we saw the prose introduction, and the scene is set. In chapter 3, the poem begins, and you get a glimpse into Job's heart and mind as he's wrestling with how hard life has become, to the point that it's become unlivable, and he longs for the grave. Now, chapter 4 and beyond, we're going to see his 3 friends finally speak up. After 7 days of silence, they now break it. And what you'll see as far as the organization of the book of Job is it goes friend, back to Job, friend 2, back to Job, friend 3, back to Job, and then do it again. And then do it again. And that's why the book is so long. This epic poem is so epic. You have 3 rounds of the 3 friends and Job going back and forth, wrestling with that mentality that sin is suffering. So notice how Eliphaz discusses it in chapter 4, verse 1 and 2. Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered and said, if we essay to commune with thee, in other words, if we try to speak, wilt thou be grieved? But who can withhold himself from speaking? He's checking in to see, is it time to shift from mourning to comforting? Maybe he's a little like me, and it's like, can we move on now? I mean, it's been 7 days. That was supposed to be completeness and totality. Are we good? And he doesn't even wait for an answer. That's his mistake. He just, I can't withhold. I've just got to go. I unfortunately did that to my daughter once, where she'd received some bad news, and I spent the first day in the mourning stage. But by day 2, I was ready to move on and fix things. And so I basically was Eliphaz there and said, hey, if I commune with thee, will you be grieved? I should have asked. She would have said, yes, so don't commune yet. I unfortunately started communing. And when I saw her reaction, I quickly retreated and said, you liked yesterday better? She's all, okay, sorry. I'll be back whenever you need me. In the meantime, I'll just mourn with those that mourn. Well, what does he say? Verse 3, behold, thou hast instructed many, and thou hast strengthened the weak hands. That's good news. Thy words have upholded him that was falling, and thou hast strengthened the feeble knees. I wish he would have ended there and just congratulated Job on such a good life. Instead, he goes on, but now it is come upon thee, and thou faintest. It toucheth thee, and thou art troubled. Is not this thy fear, thy confidence, thy hope, and the uprightness of thy ways? In other words, Job, you talked the talk. All those years of blessedness. Don't you think you should walk the walk now that times have gotten rough? I mean, if your words of faith and testimony were exactly that, your confidence and your hope, then replay them in your own ears. And think about all the things you said to people that were suffering. I've basically come to just mirror yourself and try to let yourself preach from the pulpit of memory, as Elder Maxwell used to say, to convince you that what you said to others was true, and it applies equally in your own case. Now, even that, if he would have stopped, would have been better than what he goes on to. Because in 7, he falls back into his flawed, shallow mentality, his stage 1 perspective on sin and suffering. He says in verse 7, "Remember, I pray thee, whoever perished, being innocent, or where were the righteous cut off? Even as I have seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness reap the same." Now that's the first explicit statement of the prevailing ideology in the book of Job. And we've seen it already throughout the Old Testament. We see it throughout the Book of Mormon. We probably grew up feeling that way ourselves because it's true to a point. This is simply the law of the harvest, right? Wickedness never was happiness. If you sow the wind, you'll reap the whirlwind. Now, so far, this isn't an explicit condemnation of Job, at least not specifically listing sins. We'll get there, unfortunately. This is more of the vague generalization, like, well, you know, Job, as I'm sure you've taught to other people as well, if you do bad things, then bad things come back to haunt you. And so I'll just leave it at that. But this subtle insinuation that Job, you're probably to blame here. After all, verse 17, shall mortal man be more just than God? I mean, I know first impressions were amazing back in Job 1 verse 1, but your perfection doesn't match God's perfection. Your uprightness isn't quite that lofty. So he goes on, shall a man be more pure than his maker? The assumed answer is no. Behold, he put no trust in his servants, and his angels he charged with folly. How much less in them that dwell in houses of clay, whose foundation is in the dust, which are crushed before the moth. Job, my friend, we are nothing. We're less than the dust of the earth. We're less than the moths. We're certainly less than the angels, which means we are infinitely less than God. So, whatever you did, and I'm not going to point fingers much, just repent of it, and I'm sure all will be well. He says more of the same in chapter 5. In verse 1, call now, if there be any that will answer thee, and to which of the saints wilt thou turn? I mean, Job, who's going to plead your case? The holy ones, those saints, know that we aren't perfectly holy, and we get what we deserve. It's what's happening to you right now, for whatever it was that you did. Pleading your case, I don't know if you'll be able to find an adequate defense attorney, an advocate that will be able to get you off the hook. In verse 6, although affliction cometh not forth of the dust, it doesn't just arise out of nowhere, neither doth trouble spring out of the ground, yet man is born unto trouble as the sparks fly upward. Again, he's just reiterating cause and effect. If you're suffering, there must be some reason. And if you didn't know already, the reason is the natural unrighteousness of man. I'm not trying to make you feel bad. It's what we all deal with, okay? It's part of the mortal condition. Sin is, which means suffering is, since sin and suffering are synonymous. In verse 8, I would seek unto God, and unto God would I commit my cause, which doeth great things and unsearchable, marvelous things without number. Well, that's a beautiful testimony of God. And if you just would have left it at that, just commit your cause to God who does great things. But I do wonder also if there's some hint of accusation there. It'll become more than a hint later on. But Job, you must be falling short of the divine standard. Otherwise, you wouldn't be going through what you're going through. In verse 12, he, meaning God, disappointeth the devices of the crafty, so that their hands cannot perform their enterprise. He taketh the wise in their own craftiness, and the counsel of the froward is carried headlong. They meet with darkness in the daytime, and grope in the noonday as in the night. Now, I really want to agree with you, Eliphaz, and to a large degree, you're right. God does disappoint the devices of the crafty. The wicked do end up having to pay the piper. But the problem is that doesn't always happen immediately. And so, yes, you're right, but is that always the case in the short term? Because unfortunately, look around and it seems that sometimes the wicked do prosper. And sometimes the righteous do seem to suffer. And so your simplified approach to sin equals suffering seems to be short-sighted. There's got to be more to this than just that simplified version. So Job, verse 17, be happy. Because behold, happy is the man whom God correcteth. Therefore despise not thou the chastening of the Almighty, for he maketh sore and bindeth up. He woundeth and his hands make whole. I actually really like Eliphaz, for the most part. He is a friend, and he's trying to be a good one to Job. There's amazing truth in what he just said. Happy is the man that God correcteth. Because what's the correcting for? What's amazing about a call to repentance is it's a message of hope. It's a declaration of confidence that I know you can change. I know you want to. And although the pain that your sin has caused you has not been pleasant, if it moves you in the right direction, then it was all worth it. Yes, I've made you sore, but I'm here to bind you up. You can say that to pain. Pain alerted us that something wrong was happening to our body, and then we can go get the help that we need. The same is true of guilt. Guilt is to the spirit what pain is to the body. And when our nerves are exposed to that pain, when our conscience is pricked by that guilt, it lets us know we're leaning on the stove. Get your hand off it because it'll burn. My grandma lost feeling in her finger because of an accident once, and I was jealous at the time because she had no feeling in her fingertip. They were able to sew it back on, but the nerve damage was done. And I remember thinking that would be so cool, like a superpower. No pain to be felt at all, until I realized the problem with that. Pain is my friend if it alerts me to get away from what's causing it. And so, yes, I'm sorry about your soreness, but I'm here to bind you up. I'm sorry for your wounds, but I am wholeness, and I've come to help. Like I said, that is good advice, especially based on their understanding of the law of the harvest. The problem was it didn't apply in Job's case, and Job knew it. Now, what we're about to see in chapter 6 is Job's first rebuttal. And it's going to go back and forth between the three friends over and over and over, and it always comes back to Job defending himself. But the irony of Job's defense is that it proves that he had the same misperception that his friends did. He believed, just like they did, just like Lehi did, just like the Deuteronomy does, just like most of us do in our childhood, that sin is suffering and immediate consequences and everything else. It's black and white, and that's just how it works. And bad guys suffer and good guys prosper, and there's nothing in between. The difference between Job and his friends was the angle they were approaching things from. They both looked at things that sin equals suffering. The difference was the friends saw the suffering and therefore assumed the sin, whereas Job knew there was no sin and therefore questioned the suffering. You understand what I'm saying? It's amazing once you realize that they agreed on their premises. They just came to different conclusions because of the different experiences or perceptions that they had. In the friend's case, I see you suffering. What did you do wrong? Just repent. The Lord is chastening you. So be happy that He thinks that you're worth correcting. Appreciate this redemptive turbulence, as Elder Maxwell used to call it. Whereas Job is still befuddled here because I don't deserve what I'm going through. And he was right. Go back to chapter 1 and chapter 2. The problem is Job never read chapter 1 and chapter 2 of his own book. And neither did his friends. They're unaware about the conversation between Satan and God. They're unaware that this is a test to see what you'll do without the hedge. That this is mortal life. And you're meant to be stretched and pulled and sometimes almost broken so that you become something. something amazing through the process. We are lucky to have read chapter 1 and 2, to know what's going on. It's like any play or movie where the audience has been made aware of certain things that the characters on the stage don't know about. You almost want to yell up to them, "He's the bad guy. He's the one. He's conspiring against you." But no, we can't. Okay, and so here, Job, in his ignorance of the cause of his suffering, and his friends, ignorant of Job's innocence, no wonder they're struggling, and no wonder they can't see eye to eye because of their opposing angles, even though they share the same underlying belief. That was mind-blowing to me when I realized, whoa, they have the same misconception. So see how Job responds in chapter 6, verse 1. But Job answered and said, "Oh, that my grief were thoroughly weighed, and my calamity laid in the balances together. For now it would be heavier than the sand of the sea. Therefore my words are swallowed up, for the arrows of the Almighty are within me. The poison whereof drinketh up my spirit. The terrors of God do set themselves in array against me." Job is suffering. The arrows of the Almighty, poison tipped and all. And he has brought me so low that I long for the grave. I wish you knew just what I was going through. I would take all of my trials and lay them on the balance, and you would see just how crushing they are. But what he's wondering with that balance and scales metaphor is, what's on the other side? On the one side of the balance are all my griefs and all of my sorrows and sufferings. And they are heavier than the sands of the sea, which would suggest that since the balances are always supposed to be equal, sin equals suffering, righteousness equals blessedness, that truth has carried me through my life, and I've been perfect and upright, and I was the greatest of all the men of the East. But now for my suffering to be that heavy, then my sin would have to be equally heavy. That's the only way it works. That's what justice demands, an even balance. And the scales are skewed. Something's off, because I have done nothing to deserve the kind of suffering that I'm enduring here. In verse 8 he says, "Oh, that I might have my request, and that God would grant me the thing that I long for, even that it would please God to destroy me, that he would let loose his hand and cut me off. Then should I have comfort, yea, I would harden myself in sorrow. Let him not spare, for I have not concealed the words of the Holy One." We're back to this idea of longing for death, because life has become unlivable. I actually read this once in a study of suicide, that often people who contemplate it, it's not because they value life too little. It's because in some ways they value life too much. Too much to allow it to continue in the condition that it's in at that time. That I know what life is supposed to be. Life is supposed to be good. Life is supposed to have hope and meaning and purpose, and mine doesn't. And rather than just slog through or suffer through a life that doesn't measure up to what life is supposed to be, I have to end it. And again, that mentality is flawed. It is deeply flawed. And therapy or medication or hospitalization or just help, seek it if you're in that situation. But what Job is wrestling with here is this same sense of what life is supposed to be. And it isn't. Up to this point, the balances have always stayed steady. I know how it's supposed to work, and it's worked right. It's just not working now. His sense of justice is now being tested. Remember Zophar, when he did commit suicide because mercy came into his life and he couldn't handle it? An unbending justice with no ability to prove a contrary? Well, Job is wrestling with this same kind of concern. Add it to the list of his adversities. That all of a sudden now my own worldview is coming crushing down. Talk about a faith crisis. And it's not a crisis of faith in God. He's not cursing him. But it's a faith crisis that something's amiss in the workings of reality. and I'm being punished for sins I never committed. Something's off here. He then turns back to his friend Eliphaz and says to him in 14, to him that is afflicted, pity should be showed from his friend. So in the midst of my devastation, please don't lecture me. I preferred the silence. Thank you very much. Just empathize. Just offer compassion. And in fact, if you're going to lecture, you could at least allow your principles to be true. In verse 24, he says, teach me, and I will hold my tongue. Cause me to understand wherein I have erred. How forcible are right words, but what doth your arguing reprove? Your message is falling on deaf ears because it doesn't apply to me. All these things you've said about the wicked suffering because of their wickedness, I totally agree, Eliphaz. They just don't apply because I'm not the wicked one. I know the balances are supposed to stay straight. They always have in my life. They're just not working right now. So if you think I've done something wrong, help me. Oh, believe me, I'd love to know what's in my blind spot that I haven't been aware of. I search out blind spots. I offer burnt sacrifices just in case. The first impression was correct. I'm perfect and upright. I eschew evil every time. And so help me understand wherein I have erred, because I don't see any of it. He says in verse 30, is there iniquity in my tongue? Cannot my taste discern perverse things? Again, show me where I've been wrong. I would know it. I have sufficient discernment to recognize when I'm doing something that I shouldn't. I would taste it if I've done wrong. But there is no bitterness in my mouth as far as sin is concerned. Only the bitterness that comes from suffering. And it's the undeserved kind. Job continues in chapter 7. He says in verse 4, when I lie down, I say, when shall I arise and the night be gone? I am full of tossings to and fro unto the dawning of the day. My flesh is clothed with worms and clods of dust. My skin is broken and become loathsome. His catalog of calamities keeps growing longer and longer. For people who suffer, often sleep is their one welcome relief. And yet it wasn't for Job. From sunup to sundown, it's suffering, but from sundown to sunup, it's tossing to and fro. Imagine, again, boils from the sole of the foot to the crown of the head. Is there any place that you can get comfortable among the potsherds and ashes? Have you ever had a night that you just wished would end? And you were praying for the dawn? In verse 13, he goes on, when I say my bed shall comfort me, my couch shall ease my complaint. That doesn't work either, because then thou scarest me with dreams and terrifies me through visions. Even when sleep does finally come, it doesn't last, because I'm being haunted by nightmares. There is no escaping. I told you that Satan got the green light and was going to push him to the very brink of death. So close to the edge that Job himself was hoping that God would push him over it. But no, he stays there. There's one thing about trials. There's another thing about the irony of those trials. There's another thing about the unfairness of those trials. There's another thing about the length and persistence of those trials. So often, if we just knew the end date, if we knew how long they were going to last, then we could try to endure them well. But when there seems to be no end in sight, no escaping them, I can't sleep. When I do, I have nightmares that wake me back up, and who knows how long this is going to last. No wonder he says in verse 11, therefore I will not refrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. We need this, by the way. We need this view of Job. We missed it in chapter 1 when the verb was worship. It hadn't intensified yet to the point where Job was to his breaking point. We all seem to have one. What does it take to get someone to complain against God? In the Book of Mormon, Sariah's case, it was the thought of losing her sons. In Lehi's case, it was the thought of being unable to provide for his family. In Nephi's case, it was the thought of not being able to keep the family together to maintain the unity his father had begged him to preserve before he died. We all have something that gets us to a point of wondering, what's the point of it all? And for Job, he'd gotten there. He complained in the bitterness of his soul. Still not cursing God, though. Notice what he says instead. 17, what is man, that thou shouldst magnify him, and that thou shouldst set thine heart upon him? He's crying to God with this. That thou shouldst visit him every morning and try him every moment. He's getting closer to the truth here. Try him every moment? Is he learning that life is meant to be a test? I don't think he quite gets it yet, but these words are foreshadowing something, a realization that will come later. The way he phrases those verses, though, who am I that you would even care? It's one thing to be surprised that God cares about us enough to bless us. This is the opposite. It's to be surprised that God cares enough to make us suffer. That he cares enough to try us and to stretch us and to prove us. Just kick me off the team, coach. I'm not good. Oh no, I want to keep you on the team and run another lap and do another drill because I believe in you. Why? I'm nothing. Why would you set your heart upon me? This magnificent book gives us such fascinating insight into the nature of the human experience, into the character of God, how God feels about us, how we should feel about God, what suffering does to add some heat and intensity to the mix. It's amazing, this message. Why would you care enough to bless us or curse us? Because God loves us and believes in us and wants us to come home having become more like him through our trials. In verse 20, Job makes an interesting admission. I have sinned. Fine, let me admit that. Although I don't know how, I guess I must have, based on the fact that I'm suffering. I'm not guilty of the things that my friends might accuse me of, but maybe there's something back there. Again, I'm trusting the balance here. But then this, what shall I do unto thee, O thou preserver of men? Why hast thou set me as a mark against thee, so that I am a burden to myself? And why dost thou not pardon my transgression and take away mine iniquity? For now shall I sleep in the dust, and thou shalt seek me in the morning, but I shall not be. I think what Job is getting at there is, I don't know how much longer I'll last. I don't know how much longer my body will allow this to happen. And if you're hoping to forgive me, then let it happen, because I don't know how much longer I'll have. There's a sense of, what have I done in the past, and what am I supposed to do in my present? But also a sense of, I have no future. So if this is meant to scour the soul, then finish the job as quickly as you can, because I want this to end. But what doesn't end is the conversation. Eliphaz is done. Job is done responding to him, but now Bildad comes in. And friend number 2 speaks up in chapter 8 and says in verse 1, how long wilt thou speak these things? How long shall the words of thy mouth be like a strong wind? Doth God pervert judgment, or doth the Almighty pervert justice? Quit trying to justify yourself before God, Job. It will get you nowhere. I mean, Eliphaz was right. You're lower than the angels, lower than the dust. And let me reiterate that. God must move in the opposite direction. God is above the dust, and above man, and above the angels, and above all things. He doesn't get things wrong. But again, because I share the same underlying premise, the fact that God doesn't get anything wrong, and the fact that you're suffering, suggests that you're in the wrong. You've done wrong, and you deserve the suffering because you're guilty of the sin. In verse 5, he says, if thou wouldst seek unto God betimes, and make thy supplication to the Almighty, if thou wert pure and upright, which obviously you aren't, surely now he would awake for thee, and make the habitation of thy righteousness prosperous. Oh, there's another nod to the sin equals suffering mentality. Another pointing toward the prosperity gospel. Again, there's truth there, but not a fullness of truth. We've only got half the contrary, and we've got to prove the other side. In verse 8, for inquire, I pray thee, of the former age, prepare thyself to the search of their fathers. For we are but of yesterday, and know nothing, because our days upon earth are a shadow. Shall not they teach thee and tell thee and utter words out of their heart? You see, we have to learn from the past, Job, because none of us live long enough to master all of life's lessons in a single lifetime. So inquire of the former age. And what will they tell you? They'll tell you that sin equals suffering. They'll tell you of the natural depravity of the natural man. And so you're old enough to have learned this experientially, not just from our history lessons, but either way, you need to realize that you're deserving of whatever it is that you go through. Bildad then mentions plants that wither and die, and then says in verse 13, so are the paths of all that forget God. They wither and die. And the hypocrite's hope shall perish, whose hope shall be cut off, and whose trust shall be a spider's web. There is no hope without the rope of the Redeemer. And you are hanging by a thread, Job. It's beginning to unravel as we speak. And so lay hold upon the Redeemer himself. Repent of whatever sins you might be guilty of. Just change. After all, verse 20, God will not cast away a perfect man, neither will he help the evildoers. There's justice on both sides. The wicked will suffer. The righteous will prosper. God does not cast away perfections, which means you must not be perfect. Job chapter 1 verse 1 notwithstanding. And yet Job knows chapter 1 verse 1. He knows that much about himself. And so he responds in chapter 9 with self-defense. Verse 1, Job answers and said, I know it is so of a truth, but how should man be just with God? If he will contend with him, he cannot answer him 1 of 1,000. I'll see your argument. I'll even honor it. You're not telling me anything I don't already know. I agree with that. It just doesn't apply to me because I've been righteous. How can man be just with God? I've spent my life aiming for exactly that. When he says he cannot answer him 1 of 1,000, remember that though. Because by the end of the book of Job, God will have some answers for Job. Some questions for Job. Not quite 1,000 of them. But no matter how many there are or few, Job can't answer them at all. He cannot answer him 1 of 1,000, even though he wants to contend with God over these things. There's some hints being dropped at the beginning of chapter 9 that we'll see come to fruition later on. But he keeps speaking of God in verse 4. Job says, he is wise in heart. There's God's omniscience. And mighty in strength. There's God's omnipotence. Who hath hardened himself against him and hath prospered? There's a good question to consider, Job. One you need to keep wrestling with. What good does it do to curse God? What good does it do to contend against him, to harden yourself against him? Because he's omnipotent. You can't get around that. He's omniscient. He knows better than you. And if Job would simply hold on to that, we'd be okay. The problem is the longer these trials last and the longer he suffers with the injustice of it all, the scales are not balanced. Something is off. Oh, he's going to get closer and closer, not to cursing God, but yes, wanting to contend with him. Now, his testimony is still strong to this point. In verse 5, he speaks of the God which removeth the mountains, and they know not, which overturneth them in his anger, which shaketh the earth out of her place, and the pillars thereof tremble, which commandeth the sun, and it riseth not, and sealeth up the waters, which alone spreadeth out the heavens, and treadeth upon the waves of the sea, which maketh Arcturus, Orion, and Pleiades, and the chambers of the south. Wow, we're getting our geology lesson, our astronomy lesson. Remember this for future reference. Job is turning to the creation for his evidence of God. His omnipotence and his omniscience, which he just mentioned a verse before, it's all things are created and made to bear witness of him. All things are a testimony that God lives and that things are in perfect order. Then why isn't my life in perfect order? It has been to this point. It no longer is. He goes on in verse 10, which doeth great things past finding out, yea, wonders without number. That is a hugely important admission. We don't always know what God is doing. He does great things past finding out. It's amazing that by the end of this book, Job could almost review his message and see that he'd been preaching himself the correct sermon all along. It doesn't totally dawn on him yet just how applicable these words are to his own circumstance. But he's closer to the truth than we realize. I think that's often the case with us as well. He adds in verse 12, behold, he taketh away. Who can hinder him? Obviously I can't, since he's taken away everything that belonged to me. Who will say unto him, what doest thou? And yet he's beginning to wonder, why do we second guess omniscience? Well, because there's times we feel like we know better than he does. Why do we demand that God explain himself? Well, because sometimes we think he's got things all wrong. In verse 14, how much less shall I answer him, and choose out my words to reason with him? Whom, though I were righteous, yet would I not answer, but I would make supplication to my judge. Now we'll see about 30 chapters from now, it would have been wiser for Job to hold on to the exact things he's saying in this chapter, honoring God's omnipotence and his omniscience, not calling into question his moral governance of the universe. Like he says here, who am I to answer God? I'm nobody. How would I even make supplication to my judge when the judge of all the earth does right? Even if I were righteous, how would I answer? Well, hold to that, Job, because you keep holding to your righteousness and you're justified in doing so, but you do end up wanting to call out God, and you're not justified in that. In verse 19, he says, if I speak of strength, lo, he is strong. And if of judgment, who shall set me a time to plead? If I justify myself, mine own mouth shall condemn me. If I say I am perfect, it shall also prove me perverse. Though I were perfect, yet would I not know my soul. I would despise my life. These are profound truths that, like I said, I wish Job had held onto more strongly. When he speaks of judgment and wanting a time to plead, he's going to start demanding that. I do want to make judgment against the judge. What we're going to see in upcoming chapters is that Job basically wants to sue God for malpractice because the scales are off. The balance that's always been correct, and I've been playing the game correctly and winning it, well, now it's no longer working. And so something's off, and you've got some explaining to do. My friends keep saying, I've got some explaining to do because of my so-called sin that's caused my suffering. But I think actually, God, you've got some explaining to do for my suffering since there's been no sin. So I don't get it. But at this point, there's still enough humility to acknowledge, man, if I tried something like that, my own mouth would condemn me. What, am I going to be my own defense attorney? Well, yeah, that's what you're going to become later on. Though I were perfect, yet would I not know my soul? That's an amazing insight as well. Even if I were perfect, even if I were sinless, flawless, would I be completely self-aware? Because that's not really sin, because that's blind spots. That's sinning in ignorance, or just ignorance of self. That isn't sinful. But do I really know who I am? To me, there's something profound about realizing just how self-aware God wants us to become. An awareness of who we are in relation to Him, who we are in relation to one another, who we are in relation to our best selves. And mere perfection, I know that phrase sounds strange, because, wait, perfection, that's nothing mere about that. Well, compared to God, then even sinlessness in life, and I'm not saying that Job was absolutely sinless, but if he's our perfect type, someone who's meant to personify that, even that isn't necessarily completely self-aware. And when we talked about creation, fall, atonement, and I've mentioned that the elevation of the atonement far surpasses the elevation of Eden. We had to go down, but then we go up, and not just upward backward, but upward forward to something that far surpassed the original. And what I'm getting at is the innocence of Eden is surpassed by the holiness of the atonement. And part of this about, even if I were perfect, but remained in the Garden of Eden, that was an ignorant and innocent bliss. But I had to learn. And I had to come to know my soul as I passed out of Eden and went east of Eden and went through the valley of the shadow of death, but then turned to life himself and became more like him. I found that he was the embodiment of everything I was supposed to be. I came to know my soul by coming to rely on his. There's something about that growth, something about that progress. And Job isn't there yet. None of us are. But that's the goal. That's what God is moving us toward. Verse 24, Job then says, "The earth is given unto the hands of the wicked." So sometimes the wicked do prosper, despite what you've been saying, my friends. "He covereth the faces of the judges thereof." So sometimes justice isn't served in this life. He's starting to have a more nuanced perspective on the scales of justice here. He just doesn't yet see how they apply to him. "If not," he says, "where and who is he?" Other translations make that, if it's not God that's behind all this, then who? You see, Job is beginning to question the prevailing wisdom that sin equals suffering automatically and immediately. Sometimes the wicked do win, though that doesn't really make sense. Plus, you friends have told me what I agree on, which is that humanity is inherently depraved. But then again, if that's the case, and I deserve what I've gotten, then what's the point of even trying? That's what Job says near the end of this chapter, verse 29, "If I be wicked, why then labor I in vain? If there's nothing I can do about my fallen nature anyway, then why try?" But people can change. That's the beauty of it all. God, in fact, changes our nature. And that's what he's trying to do with you, Job. You just didn't realize how much perfecting you still needed when you were content at that level of perfection back in chapter 1. And so allow me to shape you and mold you and chasten you so that I can turn you into someone like me. In verse 32, "For he is not a man as I am, that I should answer him. And we should come together in judgment. Neither is there any daysman," in other words, arbiter, defense attorney, lawyer, "betwixt us, that might lay his hand upon us both." You see, Job returns quickly back to the judgment, the court case metaphor. If only there were a way to do that. But where would I come up with a defense attorney? How would God and mere man come together for judgment? In some ways, he's wondering, how do you take God to court anyway, when he is judgment and justice personified? Well, let me file that away, because the time will come where that's my ultimate desire. Chapter 10, though, he continues down this similar vein. Verse 1, "My soul is weary of my life. I will leave my complaint upon myself. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. I will say unto God, do not condemn me. Show me wherefore thou contendest with me." Here again, Job is asking God to explain himself. I am confused why I'm suffering. So please show me my sin. For most of us, that's not hard for him to do. We're well aware of it. But Job was having a harder time, and for good reason. In verse 3, he says, "Is it good unto thee that thou shouldst oppress? That thou shouldst despise the work of thine hands, and shine upon the counsel of the wicked? Hast thou eyes of flesh? Or seest thou as man seeth?" Now, Job's really having some existential concerns here, and starting to rethink not only the scales of justice, but the eternal judge himself. Is there something you get out of this? That you found it good to oppress us? Surely you're not like we are. I mean, we do those kinds of things, unfortunately. We misjudge each other, or we're harsh when we shouldn't be. we're prejudiced or we're judgmental or we falsely accuse people or condemn people for no reason, but surely my friends and I were right that you're higher than we are, that you haven't descended to our level. He says in verse 7, though, thou knowest that I'm not wicked. There is none that can deliver out of thine hand. Thine hands have made me and fashioned me together round about, yet thou dost destroy me. There's no higher court of appeal. But I'm getting no justice from this one. You know I'm not wicked. But who am I supposed to turn to if somehow you are going against justice, going against yourself? In verse 14, if I sin, then thou markest me. Thou wilt not acquit me for mine iniquity. Did you catch that courtroom language? Acquittal. If I be wicked, woe unto me. That part makes sense. It's just. But if I be righteous, which I am, yet will I not lift up my head. I am full of confusion. And that's the key insight into Job's current state. He doesn't understand what's happening to him. Life to this point has made perfect sense. It no longer does. Therefore, he says, see thou mine affliction, for it increaseth. Thou huntest me as a fierce lion, and again, thou showest thyself marvelous upon me. Which is better translated, you display your awesome power against me. How did I become thine enemy? You have blessed me my entire life, and I've lived worthy of those blessings. You've blessed me out of justice, because thou art just. What happened? I can't even lift up my head anymore. I'm full of confusion. Help me understand. And perhaps you've felt that way, of wondering why bad things happen to good people, of why you have to endure what you're going through, of why people make the choices they do, and why natural disasters, and why intense pain, and why no solutions to the problems, even when I'm doing everything I possibly can to merit the blessings of God. I am full of confusion. That applies to us so often. In verse 17, back to the courtroom language, thou renewest thy witnesses against me, and increasest thine indignation upon me. Changes and war are against me. And speaking of witnesses against him, the next one then takes the witness stand. And in chapter 11, it's Zophar's turn to speak. The third participant in round one of accusation. Verse 1, then answered Zophar the Naamathite. He said, should not the multitude of words be answered? Should a man full of talk be justified? In other words, are we just going to sit here and let Job go on like this? Should thy lies make men hold their peace, like we've been doing? When thou mockest, shall no man make thee ashamed? Zophar is coming with guns blazing. He's ready to rebuke Job for trying to justify himself, since all the evidence points at your guilt. He says in verse 4, thou hast said, my doctrine is pure, and I am clean in thine eyes, but oh, that God would speak and open his lips against thee. Eventually he will, just wait. And that he would show thee the secrets of wisdom, that they are double to that which is. Know therefore that God exacteth of thee less than thine iniquity deserveth. Now that last line is almost a perfect echo of what we saw in the book of Ezra a few weeks ago. That God has punished us less than our iniquities deserve. And that's true in our case. The problem is it doesn't seem true in Job's case. This is innocent suffering. This is the Theodicy. This is problem of evil. Why do bad things happen to good people? And Job's a good person. And so that last line doesn't apply. He's not exacting less of me than my iniquities deserve. He's exacting more. And I don't understand it. Well, hidden right before that statement, actually hidden in plain sight, is the truth that Job needed to hold to. And what Zophar had said was, God will show thee the secrets of wisdom. They're double to that which is. I love, once you've read through the book of Job and understood it from start to finish, then go back and reread it if you have time. maybe 4 years from now. Reread it to see the hints that were dropped all along the way. Because that's mortality too. We know more than we admit. We know more than we acknowledge. God has told us and told us time and again the truths that will get us safely home. And here's one that Job needs to hold to. God is omniscient. He knows what he's doing. Even if you don't, as long as you're more than nothing, then his double will be more than nothing too. Okay? His wisdom is double what you could possibly imagine. The problem is, as Zophar said, they are secrets, which means only that kind of wisdom can come from God. It only comes from revelation. It comes from self-disclosure. God has to choose to reveal himself, to reveal his will, to reveal his secrets, even his secret wisdom. Thankfully, he does that when he chooses to, when we're ready for it. In verse 7, Zophar continues, "Canst thou by searching find out God? Canst thou find out the Almighty unto perfection? It is as high as heaven. What canst thou do? Deeper than hell, what canst thou know? The measure thereof is longer than the earth and broader than the sea." Isaiah will make the same point more famously when God says that my ways are higher than thy ways. In fact, as much as the heavens are higher than the earth, yeah, that's the level of discrepancy between what you see down there and the way I see it up here. But when he says, can you find him out just by searching? Is that all you think it takes? No, there is someone else on the other side of that search who has agency of his own. So like I said, if God is going to reveal himself to you, it will come because he chose to do so. Yes, do your part. Search him out. But even despite all your study, you have to experience this, which means God has to choose to participate in the experience. In this life, we see through a glass darkly. In this life, we don't know God to perfection. We just need to know that he is perfection and rest content in trusting him. But how do we come to know God in that self-revelatory way? Look at verse 13. If thou prepare thine heart and stretch out thine hands toward him, if iniquity be in thine hand, put it far away. Let not wickedness dwell in thy tabernacles, for then shalt thou lift up thy face without spot. Yea, thou shalt be steadfast, and shalt not fear, because thou shalt forget thy misery, and remember it as waters that pass away. That's beautiful advice. His friends seem to have a lot of that mixed in with their misconceptions. But prepare your heart, stretch out thy hand, be worthy, be ready, turn to him. Repent of your sins. Again, that's where Job's going to disagree. But everything dark about life will be eclipsed by his marvelous light. Everything miserable will be eclipsed by joy. Just come unto him. But again, that's where Job is going to push back and say, what do you think I've spent my life doing? Why do you think I worshipped at the end of chapter 1 when I thought that was it? And now I can get back to normal things. No, it's getting harder and harder to trust that that's the way life works. And so he pushes back in chapter 12 and says in verse 3, but I have understanding as well as you. I'm not inferior to you. Yea, who knoweth not such things as these? Come on, Zophar. Everybody knows what you're saying. Of course God is higher than man. Obviously we have to be worthy to find him. I always have been. Verse 4, I am as one mocked of his neighbor, who calleth upon God, and he answereth him. The just upright man is laughed to scorn. One more thing to add to our list. I've been doing what's right my whole life, and I've been honored for that, respected, admired, and yet now I'm mocked for it. I'm laughed to scorn. Meanwhile, the wicked get all the respect. Verse 6, the tabernacles of robbers prosper. They that provoke God are secure, into whose hand God bringeth abundantly. Everything about life seems to be going topsy-turvy, this upside-down world that doesn't make sense anymore. Life used to be fair, and it isn't anymore. Does that sound like growing up, by the way? Going from stage 1 simplicity to stage 2 complexity and ambiguity and frustration. None of it makes sense. This is not how life is supposed to be. And Job then turns to nature as his proof. In verse 7, ask now the beasts, they'll teach thee. The fowls of the air, they shall tell thee. Or speak to the earth, and it shall teach thee. And the fishes of the sea shall declare unto thee. Who knoweth not in all these that the hand of the Lord hath wrought this? Come on, Zophar. Nature moves by fixed laws. It's predictable. Animals function on instinct, and they do what's normal for them. God made it that way. Even a fish or a fowl will tell you if they should swim or fly. We're supposed to live a certain way and be blessed for it, and I have been. Something's no longer working. He goes on in chapter 13, repeating that he already knows everything his companions have said to him. But then he adds in verse 3, surely I would speak to the Almighty, and I desire to reason with God. He's getting more bold as time goes on. Again, he wants to sue the Lord for malpractice. So let's go to court. I will defend myself. But ye, he says to his friends, you're forgers of lies. Ye are all physicians of no value. Oh, that ye would altogether hold your peace, and it should be your wisdom. I mean, the book of Job is wisdom literature, and you three friends are supposed to be coming with your wisdom to speak to me, but no, it would be more wise of you to go back to what you were doing in the earlier chapter and just sit down and shut up. Because none of what you're saying is helping. You, a physician of no value, you're doing more harm than good. So let me talk to God directly. Maybe he can explain himself. In verse 13, hold your peace. Let me alone that I may speak, and let come on me what will. I'll take whatever comes. I just want to be able to defend myself. But then he says in verse 15, though he slay me. Remember, he just said, let come on me what will. So even death penalty. Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. But I will maintain mine own ways before him. Now that's an odd verse. The first two phrases are so powerful. No matter what happens, even if God, I'm longing for death, so bring it on, please. But even if it gets to that point, if he pushes me over the edge and my suffering finally becomes fatal, I will trust in him. Now, if there were a period or an exclamation point right there, then leave it, and Job is ending on a high note. But when he adds, but I'm still going to maintain my own ways before him, there is this suggestion, but I know I'm right. In fact, maybe that's why I can trust him. I know it's going to come out, in the end. I don't know what's going on. I don't understand why there's some case of mistaken identity or why God is punishing me unjustly, but I know he is just. And I'm sticking to that. I will hold on to this sense of fairness that I know belongs to God, and so I'm going to trust him come what may. I just can't trust you, my so-called friends, because you keep accusing me of iniquity that I'm not guilty of. Something's off, but it's not me. So yes, I'll maintain my own ways. I trust that God is going to see through your false accusations, and that God will vindicate me when all is said and done. So in 17 he says, hear diligently my speech, and my declaration with your ears. Behold, now I have ordered my cause. I know that I shall be justified. Who is he that will plead with me? For now, if I hold my tongue, I shall give up the ghost. I'm ready to go serve as my own defense attorney. I'm totally confident I will be acquitted. I will be justified. I've ordered my cause. All my evidence, my witnesses, I am, Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm ready to be proven innocent today. So let's call the court into session. That's what he says in 22. Then call thou, and I will answer. Or let me speak, and answer thou me. Either way, God, at least we will be able to engage in the conversation. You can have the opening remarks as prosecution, or I'll take the opening as defense. But either way, let's begin to communicate. He asks, how many are mine iniquities and sins? Make me to know my transgression and my sin. Wherefore hidest thou thy face, and holdest me for thine enemy? The opening argument has begun as far as Job is concerned. He couldn't wait. I deserve to know what I'm being accused of. In the American Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution that set in stone the most basic human rights that every American and every person on the earth deserves, the sixth one, Job is calling for. It's the one that guarantees that the accused have the right to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation and to be confronted with the witnesses against him. That's the language of the Constitution. And that's what Job is demanding. Either I talk to you and you come, or you talk to me and I'll show up. But either way, I want face to face. I need to know what I've been accused of and who it is that is accusing me, because I trust God, but who else is out there that's making false accusations? How can I defend myself if I don't know what I'm been charged with? In verse 26, for thou writest bitter things against me, and makest me to possess the iniquities of my youth. Is that where this is coming from? Things that I did before I became a perfect and upright man? Oh, youthful indiscretions when I didn't eschew evil quite as much as I should? Is that what's happening? Dredging up things from the past that will now haunt me? Because that's all I can think of. In verse 27, thou puttest my feet also in the stocks, and lookest narrowly upon all my paths. Thou settest a print upon the heels of my feet. That's a fascinating one. You set a print on the heels of my feet? Oh, the easier to track you with. Oh, this is putting a little tracking device, some little ankle bracelet that lets you know, lets the police know if you've gone outside of your parole area. Oh, I'm going to hound you and put a print on your heel so every step you take is marked, so I know that it's you. Is that what's happening, God? You're dredging up my past. You're tailing me everywhere I go to make sure I don't do anything amiss. Because if that's the case, then I'm sure you'll find something. In chapter 14, he goes on, verse 1, man that is born of a woman is a few days, full of trouble. He cometh forth like a flower, he's cut down. He fleeth also as a shadow and continueth not. And dost thou open thine eyes upon such an one, and bring me into judgment with thee? To me, that draws you back to the end of chapter 13 with, why are you tailing me? Why is it all eyes on me, everywhere I go with this print on my heel? If I'm nothing, if man is less than the dust of the earth, if we're just going to be here for a few days and they're troublesome ones at that, then just send us to wherever you're going to send us. End things. We're not worth your trouble. We're beneath your notice. He compares human life to the life of a tree. And then he says that if you cut a tree down to the stump, at least there's still a chance of regrowing. Is there any hope for me? Because I'm down to stump level. He says in verse 10, but man dieth and wasteth away. Yea, man giveth up the ghost, and where is he? Maybe we can't send forth new shoots the way a tree can. Maybe once we've been cut down, that's all there is. And if life ends with death, and death brings on what is looking now like welcome oblivion, then again, what was the point of life to begin with? It's interesting because Judaism does not have the same sense of an afterlife that Christianity does. In the Old Testament, there's very little about resurrection and heaven and so on. That's more of a New Testament concept. Judaism focuses more on the here and now and immediate blessings. It is kind of a stage one approach to blessing and curses and immediate responses to our actions. But what's interesting is what Job is wrestling with here is there some point to this life of suffering and sorrow? Is there something that will come after it? Or is this all that we get? He wrestles with this question in verse 14, famous phrase, if a man die, shall he live again? All the days of my appointed time will I wait till my change come? That really is the question. Is this life all we get? Or will we live again? Because if this is it, then I kind of want my money back, because this has been rough. I mean, I liked the first however many years, but lately things have been unlivable. And so if I die, was any of this meaningful? Is it worth anything? It reminds me of the verse in 1 Corinthians 15 that I absolutely love, where Paul is defending the doctrine of the resurrection against people that are beginning to doubt it. And he says, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable. So yes, if this is all we get, then yeah, it wasn't worth it. But that's the point. This isn't all we get. There is so much more to existence than mortal existence. If a man die, shall he live again? The Lord's answer would be a resounding yes. This life is not all you get. And so try to step back and see your trials and tribulations through an eternal perspective. It will change your attitude toward them. But verse 15, Job is still a bit confused. Thou shalt call, and I will answer thee. I do want to go face to face in the courtroom after all. Thou wilt have a desire to the work of thine hands. At least I hope that's the case. You must have created us for something. Do you want us to be with you? Do you want me to come home? For now thou numberest my steps, including the missteps, evidently. Dost thou not watch over my sin? My transgression is sealed up in a bag, and thou sewest up mine iniquity. And what those final phrases suggest is God is preserving all the evidence against him. Picture a crime scene, and the detectives or the FBI come, and they've got all these Ziploc bags to be able to put things in so that the evidence is preserved against the perpetrator. That is Job's concern by the end of chapter 14. Whatever it is, from my early youth, the prints on the back of my heel, whatever it is, from fallen man, what's going to become of me as a result? Is there a purpose to all of this? Will I live again? Are you just trying to perpetuate my condemnation? Or is there some kind of hope on the other side that things can be okay? Job's not sure. But Eliphaz seems to be, because he's on to round 2 of his accusation. The next few chapters will repeat things that we saw in the previous, with each, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, going again, taking the witness stand. You want a court case? Fine, but we're witnesses against you. And now is my second chance to come up and rebut you. Chapter 15, Eliphaz, round 2, he's much stronger than he was in the first round. He's much more vocal and accusatory than at first. He says in verse 2, should a wise man utter vain knowledge and fill his belly with the east wind? East wind, by the way, is the source of destruction in the Middle East. Should he reason with unprofitable talk, or with speeches wherewith he can do no good? All of these are subtle, not so subtle hints at what he's accusing Job of doing. Yea, thou castest off fear, and restrainest prayer before God, for thy mouth uttereth thine iniquity, and thou choosest the tongue of the crafty. Thine own mouth condemneth thee, and not I. Yea, thine own lips testify against thee. Job, do you not realize that your own self-defense is actually self-incriminating? Your sin is to try to come across as not having any. And so you're your own worst enemy in trying to establish this absolute innocence before innocence himself. No, you hold your whatever color you happen to be against that absolute brilliant pure white, and your sins will be scarlet. You shouldn't have gone there. In verse 7, art thou the first man that was born? Or wast thou made before the hills? In other words, have you been around long enough to know everything? The answer to that is no. Hast thou heard the secret of God? And dost thou restrain wisdom to thyself? Do you know everything God knows? Like has been done before, he's pushing the wisdom of God in Job's direction. You're not older than he is. You're not wiser than he is. Just trust that God knows what he's doing. In verse 11, are the consolations of God small with thee? Now, specifically, Eliphaz is probably referring to the counsel that he and his two friends have already given Job. Are those consolations not sufficient? But more broadly, I wonder if he's getting at God's promises. Promises, his reassurances, do they mean nothing to you? We saw that earlier. You gave so many reassurances and promises and consolations to others. Let them come back to bless you. Or are they small with you? Oh, let them carry you through these trials. Let them convince you to repent. After all, verse 14, what is man that he should be clean? And he which is born of a woman that he should be righteous? We're all just fallen humans. Deal with it. Admit it, acknowledge it. Behold, he putteth no trust in his saints. Yea, the heavens are not clean in his sight. How much more abominable and filthy is man, which drinketh iniquity like water. There's an old joke in religious circles that most doctrines are taken on faith because there's no empirical proof of things like the atonement or the resurrection and so forth. And yet, they've joked and said, but human depravity, yeah, that one is empirically verifiable. We got plenty of evidence of fallen man. We see it all over. And that's what Eliphaz seems to be getting at. And like I said, if you were to juxtapose whatever purity you think you have against the purity of a perfect God, not even the heavens can measure up to God. So you drinking iniquity like water, yeah, it spills all over you. And you've got stains on your raiment like you wouldn't believe. So Job, what hope could you possibly have to defend yourself? There's no reason to keep justifying yourself, which would be true for all of the rest of us. But again, if we take seriously how Job was first presented as the ideal type of the ideal man, type and shadow of Christ, then it doesn't apply to Job. He's still going to push back. And so he does in chapter 16. Verse 1, then Job answered and said, I've heard many such things. Miserable comforters are ye all. That's a great line to memorize if you don't like the advice a friend gives. Miserable comforter. Oh, with friends like you, who needs enemies? In verse 4, I also could speak as you do, if your soul were in my soul's stead. I could heap up words against you and shake mine head at you. Yeah, go ahead, switch spots. We could have the exact same conversation. So please take your own advice. And if you want somebody to repent, then look in the mirror and repent yourself. Don't try to counsel me. In verse 10, they have gaped upon me with their mouth. They have smitten me upon the cheek reproachfully. They have gathered themselves together against me. God hath delivered me to the ungodly and turned me over into the hands of the wicked. Yes, Job is speaking of himself there. But read it again and think of Job as the type and shadow of Jesus. And could Christ say the same thing? They have gaped upon me with their mouth. They have smitten me upon the cheek reproachfully. They've gathered themselves together against me. God hath delivered me to the ungodly. He's turned me over into the hands of the wicked. When Jesus says from the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? He's quoting the Psalms. And the psalmist there giving words, giving language to what Jesus will feel on the cross. To me, one of the most profound ways to read the book of Job is to try to find similar passages that seem to give voice to what Jesus may have felt. At least the mortal side of Jesus, when he, innocence embodied, was suffering for sins he didn't commit. If you remember when we studied, 2 years ago now? In Mosiah chapter 15, that difficult passage about how Christ was able to atone, and the fact was that it came, the condescension and the incarnation is what informs the atonement. That he had to be Son of God and Son of Mary. He had to be mortal to suffer, but he had to be divine to overcome suffering. He had to be the Son of Mary to die, but the Son of God to live again. And the way Abinadi describes it is there's the Son side, that's the mortal human side, and then there's the Father side of Jesus, and that's the immortal and the divine. Well, what's amazing to me about the book of Job, once you have eyes to see, and chapter 10 is where I really started seeing it most clearly, with passages like what I just read. The book of Job is such an incredible analogy, parable, metaphor, call it what you will, a type and shadow for the atonement of Christ in terms of his dual nature. Because what did we learn about Job in chapter 1? He's perfect, he's upright, he fears God, he eschews evil. Throughout this entire time, he's been defending himself, saying, I'm innocent. And while that couldn't be perfectly true in Job's case, it was perfectly true in Jesus's. And yet what's happening to Job? He's suffering. For as if he'd committed sins that he was not personally guilty of. Think about Christ in Gethsemane and on Calvary, suffering for sins he did not commit. Now the parallel so far is beautiful. You can add to that the fact that Job, back in chapter 1, was offering sacrifices for the sins of others, his children. And Jesus does the same. He offers himself as a sacrifice for the sins of others. Think about the fact that Satan opposed Job, just like Lucifer opposed Jehovah from premortality on. Think about the fact that Job was stripped of all of his glory. Here, the greatest man of the East, the one in whom God was most well pleased, the only begotten in the flesh, the firstborn of God in the Spirit. And yet he condescended. He was stripped of his flocks and herds. He was taken from his premortal divine family, sent to earth to suffer, to experience, to empathize. But if you look closely at the New Testament, the closer you get to Gethsemane, you will see, scattered throughout the Gospels, places where the two sides of Jesus seem to be at war with each other. You know what that feels like on Fast Sunday, where the spirit is willing but the flesh is weak. Well, there are passages in the New Testament where you can see the Father side of Jesus and the Son side of Jesus at odds. I mean, you see it clearly in Gethsemane. Let this cup pass from me. That's the Son side speaking. Nevertheless, not my will, but thine be done. That's the Father side answering back. And when Jesus falls on his face in Gethsemane and is sore amazed, when he says, Father, what shall I say? Let this cup pass from me, but for this purpose came I into the world. There again you see him torn between his divine mission and the mortal pain he would suffer in order to accomplish it. I wish we knew more about what Jesus felt. I wish we could hear the inner dialogue as he was wrestling with himself. And the book of Job, I think, gives us a chance to lean in and eavesdrop in incredibly sacred space. Because as I read Job as a type of Jesus, and not his complaint, not that kind of, not that kind of wrestling, but the kinds of things he says as an innocent victim, I do see glimpses of what the mortal side of Jesus must have been feeling as he approached the garden and the cross. That is one powerful place to see it. And I would encourage you in your study of the book of Job, keep an eye out for it. And absent any kind of angry oppositionality, hear in the words of Job the feelings of Jesus. You will come away with a deeper appreciation for what Jesus did because he never succumbed to the kind of complaint of Job, but what he was feeling and wrestling with. Son of Mary versus Son of God. It's incredible that he was able to go through with what he was sent to earth to accomplish. It's amazing. In verse 12, you'll see more of it. I was at ease, but he hath broken me asunder. He hath also taken me by my neck and shaken me to pieces and set me up for his mark. I've become the target of every sin, every sorrow. And that's exactly what Jesus was. His archers compass me round about. We saw earlier the arrows of the Almighty. It's happening again, these fiery darts coming at him from every direction. Can you picture him in Gethsemane, on Calvary, under such circumstances? He cleaveth my reins asunder. That's his bowels. It's this broken heart that he's experiencing. He doth not spare, nor could the Father spare the Son. He poureth out my gall upon the ground. There's the bitter cup that could not be taken from him. He breaketh me with breach upon breach. He runneth upon me like a giant. Oh, the Son of God was crushed under the weight of the Father's plan. And I can almost hear Job's words in the voice of Jesus. In verse 15, I have sewed sackcloth upon my skin. I thought sackcloth was supposed to be worn over your skin, so you can take it off when your mourning is over. Well, this is a permanent state of mourning. Sew it to your own skin. I defiled my horn in the dust. Other translations, I buried my brow in the dust, or I laid my strength in the dust. My face is foul with weeping, and on my eyelids is the shadow of death. A foul face with weeping, we call that an ugly cry. Isaiah described it as his visage was so marred more than any man. And then Job goes on, not for any injustice in mine hands. Also my prayer is pure. This is innocent suffering, which is exactly what Jesus personifies. He is the God of every innocent victim because he was no one more innocent and no one more victimized than he. Job, I remember once my sweet little son suffering because of his own mental illness and complaining once as a little boy to me, my life is harder than anyone who's ever lived. And I said to him, I should have mourned with him. Instead, I tried to comfort. And I said to him, you know, Jesus had it worse. When he said to Joseph Smith, the Son of Man hath descended below all things. Art thou greater than he? And so Joseph Smith probably had it worse than you. And Job had it worse than you, because that's another one that Jesus calls upon to reassure Joseph. You're not yet as Job. So even beyond Christ, Joseph Smith and Job probably had it worse than you, son. And it was so funny. I tried to keep a straight face because he was in anguish. But he said to me, that's exactly what Mom said. So, yes, my wife knows the scriptures well also. But then he said, fine, then I'm number 3. That's when I tried to keep the straight face. I'm like, okay, then hold on to that bronze medal. The 3rd hardest life that's ever been lived. Oh, there's probably a few others that rank higher. But what's interesting when we're suffering like that, and misery loves company, I suppose, looking for others who are in the fellowship of suffering, as Paul calls it, well, no one has suffered more than Jesus. And if we can turn to Job for insight into what Jesus endured, then perhaps we'll trust his atonement more than we do. And we will lay hold of the compassion that the condescension makes possible. Keep reading, though, and see Jesus in Job in a few more verses. Verse 18, O earth, cover not thou my blood, and let my cry have no place. Better translation for that, may my cry never be laid to rest. See what Job is asking for? I want the world to know of my suffering. But again, think of Jesus. And to cry repentance, to preach the atonement of Christ, to make sure his blood is not covered or forgotten, to make sure his cries are never laid to rest. Also now, Job goes on, behold, my witness is in heaven, and my record is on high. God knows the real me. My friends scorn me, but mine eye poureth out tears unto God. Oh, that one might plead for a man with God, as a man pleadeth for his neighbor, which is exactly what Jesus does, our advocate with the Father. But if he pleads for us, who could possibly plead for him? No wonder he says that he trod the winepress alone, and none were with him. No wonder he lamented, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? There's no one that could come. Job ends here, when a few years are come, then I shall go the way whence I shall not return. I will die. And that's the culmination of Christ's experience on the cross, when he gave up the ghost. And yet he did return. And so would Job. If a man die, shall he live again? Yes. For just as Christ died and rose again, so shall we. Christ knows exactly what you're feeling, Job. He suffered to empathize with you. Chapter 17, Job then goes on. In verse 6, he hath made me also a byword of the people. And aforetime I was as a tabret, which is a small drum, something to be smitten. Other translations say it's a man in whose face people spit. Again, sound like Jesus? Mine eye also is dim by reason of sorrow, and all my members are as a shadow. A man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, that was Jesus. In verse 14, I have said to corruption, in other words to death, thou art my father. To the worm, thou art my mother and my sister. And where is now my hope? As for my hope, who shall see it? Where did Christ see hope? From the cross. Isaiah says that there he would see his seed. He would see those for whom he suffered and died. And that would give him hope. That would reassure him that his sacrifice was not in vain. In Job's case, what hope did he have for the future? Well, his hope would come through God, as it is with all of us. But that's not the kind of reassurance his friends are giving. In chapter 18, it's Bildad's turn to go for round number 2. And it's no more hopeful than round number 1. In verse 1, then answered Bildad the Shuhite and said, how long will it be ere ye make an end of words? Mark, and afterwards we will speak. So are you done yet, Job? Get it all out. Just vent whatever you're going to say it, so that we can then respond and move forward. Of course, he doesn't wait for the mark. He responds anyway, and returns to the point he'd made earlier about inescapable suffering if you're wicked. There's no getting around it. It's just the law of the harvest. In verse 5, he says, yea, the light of the wicked shall be put out. And that looks like what's happening to you. The spark of his fire shall not shine. The light shall be dark in his tabernacle. His candle shall be put out with him. The steps of his strength shall be straitened, and his own counsel shall cast him down. For he is cast into a net by his own feet, and he walketh upon a snare. Reminds me of what Elder Packer used to say, that we are more often punished by our sins than for them. Oh, God doesn't even have to come down to punish you. You're already punishing yourself. You've cast your feet into a net of your own making. And so no wonder you're suffering. You brought it upon yourself. In verse 14, his confidence shall be rooted out of his tabernacle, and it shall bring him to the king of terrors. The king of terrors is death. And life is typically long enough and hard enough to truly humble us. As I've said to my son in his sufferings, life has to be hard enough to convince us that we couldn't make it through it on our own. And here, as Bildad is saying similar things to Job, his confidence is what needs to be rooted out. Job, you're overconfident in yourself. To think that you can stand up to God, to think that you can justify yourself in his sight, No. So no wonder your pride has to be pulled away from you. In verse 16, his roots shall be dried up beneath, and above shall his branch be cut off. Sounds like Malachi 4, that the ultimate curse, that you will be cut off and have neither roots nor branches. No family tree, and that seems to be what's happened to Job. Bildad then continues describing the forlorn and forgotten state of the wicked, and ends in verse 21, surely such are the dwellings of the wicked, and I'm including you in the list, Job. This is the place of him that knoweth not God. There's another not so subtle accusation. Are you ignorant of God? Do you not know him? Or are you ignoring God? You don't want to know him? Well, that's completely inappropriate as far as Job is concerned. Absolutely false. How dare you make such an accusation? And chapter 9 is a powerful chapter where Job responds to Bildad and comes to his own defense once again. A powerful testimony here because he's been accused. You don't even know God. Oh, how dare you say that? In chapter 19, verse 1, Job answers and said, how long will ye vex my soul and break me in pieces with words? You're no help at all, Bildad. Again, miserable counselors are ye all, physicians of no value. Verse 4, be it indeed that I have erred, mine error remaineth with myself. Fine. If I'm wrong, then it's my problem. You can't even fix it anyway. Verse 7, behold, I cry out of wrong, but I'm not heard. I cry aloud, but there is no judgment. He hath fenced up my way that I cannot pass, and he hath set darkness in my paths. He hath stripped me of my glory, and taken the crown from my head. And that may have been true of Job, but it was even truer of Jesus. Stripped of glory, taken the crown, that is the condescension of Christ. Verse 12, his troops come together and raise up their way against me, and encamp round about my tabernacle. He hath put my brethren far from me, and mine acquaintance are verily estranged from me. My kinsfolk have failed, my familiar friends have forgotten me. And yeah, I'm looking at you three. Have you forgotten who I am and how I've lived and how I've treated you, friends? Again, this is Job and Jesus. Christ, who was abandoned by his disciples, who was betrayed by Judas, who was denied by Peter. My familiar friends turning their backs. In verse 17, my breath, which can also mean my spirit, is strange to my wife. Here she is mentioned again. Though I entreated for the children's sake of mine own body. A better translation, I am loathsome to my own family. Yea, young children despised me. I arose, and they spake against me. All my inward friends abhorred me, and they whom I loved are turned against me. Rejected by his own. Again, another parallel between Job and Jesus. But when he says, my own wife, my own family, my spirit is strange to my wife. Well, hers was strange to you back in chapter 2. She was wrestling with her crisis of faith. Have you now caught up to her? Have you surpassed her to the point that now she looks at you and wonders, who is this? What has happened to my sweet, submissive husband? Your soul is strange to me. His family feeling the same. This would be brothers, sisters, perhaps parents if they're still alive, because his children are no more. In verse 20, my bone cleaveth to my skin and to my flesh. I am escaped with the skin of my teeth. That's where that phrase comes from. Have pity upon me, have pity upon me, O ye my friends, for the hand of God hath touched me. Oh, please don't lecture me. Please don't falsely accuse me. Just pity, just compassion. Can we go back to chapter 3 and where you were kind? I wish we could go back to chapter 1 when God was. But then he says in verse 23 and 4, and the way this chapter ends is absolutely magnificent. Oh, that my words were now written. And here they are. Oh, that they were printed in a book, and that book is open before us. That they were graven with an iron pen and lead in the rock, forever. Now, whatever he's about to say, he obviously means. What could possibly be so important that Job wants it written? In fact, he wants it in a book. In fact, he wants it engraved in stone so that it can never be rubbed out. This is what he wants. Verse 25, for the world to know, for I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. And though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and mine eyes shall behold, and not another, though my reins be consumed within me. This is a personal, independent testimony. I, myself, not another. And what's his testimony of? That no matter how dark his days are, light will come. I don't get it. This is one of those moments, when we saw it with Sarah, the superhuman self-sacrifice with Hagar, and then, pride from above being brought out by pride from below. We all have moments of sainthood and moments of sinnerhood. We all have times where we are less than what we should be, and other times where the Spirit straightens up within us and we say things that we hope the angels will record in permanent iron and lead. That's the case for Job. This is about the midpoint of this magnificent book. And there, as chapter 19 comes to its end, such a powerful testimony of what? Of the resurrection. Earlier he was wondering, if a man die, shall he live again? Well, here is a powerful declaration of his faith, that no matter what happens to me, even if worms consume my skin and my corpse decomposes in the earth, in my flesh shall I see God. Not just the ongoing existence of the human spirit, but a corporeal resurrection, a body that rises from the tomb. He had a testimony of that. And what else did he have a testimony of? His Redeemer, that he lives. Earlier he had said, in another moment of clarity and power, though he kill me, yet I will trust in him. Well, here again, I know he lives. In the latter day, someday, far beyond my own, he shall stand upon the earth. What a prophecy, what a promise. But even before that great millennial day, even before the second coming of Christ to the world, I will have a first coming to him. And I know I'll see him. I'll know I'll see him beyond that. As I rise from the grave, my Redeemer lives. The next time we sing that beautiful hymn, I know that my Redeemer lives, I hope that we can sense Job singing alongside us. That despite all that he's been through, there's a part of me that wishes that the book ended right there, or that our lesson could find its finale, because there is yet a lot for Job to wrestle with. We're still not even done with round 2 of his accusers. But pause here and just bask in the glow of Job's faith. That come what may, what I've been through in the past and what I yet have to go through in the future, today of all days I can testify that I know that my Redeemer liveth.